You may be busy doing something while you listen to this podcast, but you're never too busy to eat healthy if you eat Vite Ramen. This podcast is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Show support for a sponsor that supports Moore's Law is Dead at the link in the description, and if you do, make sure you use offer code BROKENSILICON. And you can also support Moore's Law is Dead if you need Windows keys or software at cdkeyoffer.com. If you go there, also use the code BROKENSILICON for 25% off Windows keys or Die Shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. All right, now let's get on with the show. Welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I'm joined by someone who's, I'm hoping, going to make it easy to start transitioning back into talking more about an entire section of the gaming hardware market that I feel like this channel is kind of just ignored last year because, I mean, there was like a new graphics card architecture or CPU architecture or something else launching to PC gaming. It felt like almost every month last gen. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. So I feel like I've kind of ignored console hardware. And I know that there should be some interesting releases coming out this year, including one that's coming out when this podcast drops. But please introduce yourself, guest.
Hi, yeah, it's Michael from NX Gamer. Thanks for having me on, Tom. It's good to be back on your chat. It's been a while since we last spoke, but like you say, you're very focused on the PC hardware, and I'm probably far more focused on the console area. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be back.
You know, I would say it really shouldn't matter. Like, I recently watched your Dead Space remake analysis, like performance analysis video, and you really got into like what's causing some of the visual artifacts on multiple platforms, including PC, and like kind of, am I wrong? I hope I'm not misremembering. You kind of like proved that variable rate shading is kind of a redundant feature once you tack on a million other pieces of resolution, variance, and upscale tech. It actually just makes it look worse, and that was the issue in that game, whether on PC or console, right?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, they're both kind of the same solution. So DLSS, FSR, they're all kind of reconstructing images from a lower base to try and reduce the fill rate, the pixel bandwidth, just everything about the image quality and shading quality is very expensive on the GPU. So by using that, you're just having that data reconstructed from previous frames. Therefore, it's much cheaper on RAM, it's much cheaper on bandwidth, it's much cheaper on throughput. If you start stacking on top VRS, which is just another version of that, it just basically reduces the shader complexity in the grid. So 2x2, 4x4. You're doing two things at once. Then you've got dynamic resolution scaling on top of that. So at every frame, you're getting a very variable rate of input to use from the previous frame to reconstruct to an end output, and it just looks terrible. That said, I totally get why the team did it. I think they were just working to a very tight deadline. They pushed it into February because they had no choice, because they wanted to hit December. They couldn't do it. And I think it was a case of they just had their targets to hit. They would have had a triage to get stuff out the door, and they would have said, you know what, VRS is a dark game. People aren't going to notice it. We'll do that in the next patch come day one or just after. And unfortunately, they missed it. Because, I mean, even to the point where my review code, right up until the day of launch, it was unlocked on PS5 and Series X. It was running up to 60 FPS in the ray tracing mode, but they capped that right on the day. So they definitely had delivery issues, but yeah, it's a weird one to miss because those two technologies stacked on top of each other, it's going to be very hard to play nice. And really, VRS is really, in my opinion, designed, well, it was designed from the get-go to work for VR. That's what it's there for. It doesn't quite work as well on a flat screen when you've got the whole visible screen in front of your eyeballs. It can stand out, which that game did.
Yeah, and And watching that video made me realize just, I think a lot of people think that any new piece of tech is going to be a silver bullet that always makes everything look better, whether it's DLSS, FSR, dynamic resolution, variable rate shading. I think the holy grail is when we're going to get some game engines that can take like 5 of these or 6 of these different things into account, and then per scene, per frame, choose the right combination. But turning them all on at once doesn't just work, right? And sometimes there's a reason devs choose to use FSR or DLSS, but not use dynamic res. And you've seen some pushback from some devs where they're like, yeah, actually, I don't think we need FSR. Dynamic resolution works well, and we think it actually looks better if we just use that. I think this game proved that they might not be lying, right? That sometimes you might just want one or the other within the constraints of the amount of time they have to make the game and make it look good enough for a deadline, right?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, engine by engine, art by art, there's a lot of factors that take into account what you're doing at the rendering stage. I mean, you could be doing anything. Dynamic resolution is very hard just as a base to put into a game, because if you've got multiple buffers being generated, which everyone has, alpha effects, particles, transparencies, all these things can have a knock-on effect when you're dynamically scaling things all over the place. It's why TAU works in Unreal Engine 4 and 5 and why people will use it, because that engine kind of takes care of a lot of that effort for you, or at least you can put it in a fixed pipeline at that stage that's well known and you've got all the support behind you. But even that said, if you're using things like ray tracing, which again has got some accumulation going on in terms of reconstructing the image with a filter, then dynamic resolution scaling is going to affect that as well. So there's definitely a case-by-case, game-by-game basis, and really only the dev knows what the best choice is. And as you quite rightly say, sometimes dynamic resolution scaling is a better solution than FSR, and only the dev would really know that. And it's like you say, it's naive to think that one solution is going to fix everything. But I think some of that comes down to these white papers and presentations where developers will always show you the best case scenario because they have to. Plus, it's always part of the pipeline. So they'll say things like, VRS can give us 20% performance improvement, but they don't add in a specific case scenario that we've just done by whacking everything up to full rate, and therefore we're getting all this benefit back because we're running our buffers at 4K, which we don't normally do. That kind of stuff. So, yeah, it's always bits and pieces within a pipeline that give performance back, and everyone runs away with it. It's like mesh shaders and things like that. There's a benefit. That's the most effective benefit. It's why the geometry engine of the PS5 is so popular. It's so potentially powerful in the system because it's the best way to do it, which is why draw something, eject it as early as you can in the pipeline. There's no better optimization than that. If you can't see it, don't draw it. VRS is kind of too late. It's right at the end. It's saying, when you've drawn it all, actually just smudge it a bit. And that doesn't save you anywhere near as much. So you've got to pick your poison, and sometimes you can't have them all.
That's interesting you say that. I don't think I had on a developer who has a lot of experience like analyzing, talking about, and really like deconstructing what's going on in the pipelines of a lot of graphics architectures. And we've talked about variable rate shading before. I've also talked to a source that works at AMD and has touched these consoles and told me that, for some reason, Sony decided to go a certain way with its geometry engine, whereas Microsoft with the Xbox Series X decided to go with, just really optimizing for a special version of variable rate shading. And I remember talking to one AMD engineer and being like, why is Sony doing that, though? They've taken these next-gen features and they've really tweaked and optimized these ones above standard RDNA 2. Why is Microsoft focusing so much on VRS and Sony doesn't seem as interested? And he wasn't that sure, but it sounds like you actually have an opinion as to why that is. And the only thing that AMD engineer could say, by the way, is maybe it just seems like something that can get in the way in streamlining the development of a game. And Sony thinks this is just do this well. A lot of the times you just don't want to give them extra work to do to get performance back at the end. Is that true then? You think that seems to be panning out in a lot of games?
I don't know. So I don't know the ins and outs of I've never even seen PS5.
But I'm interested to get another opinion on this, though, right? Because I've gotten 2 opinions, and a third one's, always great.
Yeah, no, my opinion is absolutely. So Sony are not new to this, and I'm not, bursting anyone's bubble by saying they're better at this console game than Microsoft are and ever will be. That's not an unknown. That's just the reality of it. They invest more. They have a vested interest in it. They have the biggest market share. They've got a vested interest to make their platform the best. And that platform isn't just the hardware. It's the entire SDK. They've always had that from day one. I mean, some of it was from the Sega Mega Drive days. They learned from them, certainly from the Dreamcast days, and vice versa. But they embraced giving the developers what they want, and like you quite rightly said, making the job easier. That's what Sony do first and foremost. And sometimes that isn't about giving everyone really powerful tools. It's about giving people efficiency. And developers don't want to spend ages factorizing things for certain hardware. Microsoft's view is very different. And this is always the case, like PC. Microsoft want a flat hardware agnostic platform that allows them to ship multiple titles across multiple pieces of hardware with a minimal amount of software layer for the developer, DirectX. So that's what they've got. So the reason they took VRS is because it was part of DirectX 12U. There's all marketing and all that stuff that's tied up in that as well with other manufacturers, both NVIDIA and AMD, and even Intel to some extent. So that's always part and parcel of what Xbox are doing. They're hedging their bets. PlayStation don't have that. So PlayStation are still the one true console, so to speak, as we all know it and love it back in the day, in the fact that it's a single platform, fixed function that does one thing, play games. That's it. So they can optimize everything in their pipeline, not just the hardware, but the software development kit, the entire environment that the games are built in, the compiler, everything. All of that can be factorized into exactly what it needs to do well. And just looking at games and going from speaking to some developers and the information that's what's well known, the PlayStation 5 pushes far more geometry than the Series X, just because of how that pipeline works. And some of that will be down to the fact that it doesn't draw things, it doesn't have to, but you don't see it. And whereas the Series X will, and that's one of the things.
And then it uses like VRS at the end to try to scrape back performance, right?
Yeah, exactly that. Well, if you're just a bit shy, if you can grab 10%, then 10% matters. But in reality, you're not really going to see it. So it's a quick fix, just like resolution scaling is. It's usually the last resort to get things out. I mean, you've seen it now in titles that come out all the time. You have performance issues, and then 3 months later or 2 months later, you get huge performance boosts and everyone's wowed. But it's because that's the point when they hit the optimization stage. And that's things where they'll just go in and say, do you know what, we're running for full res alpha effects and these just drop them to quarter res, and we'll just put some smoothing filter over the top. You'll never notice it. It's almost impossible to see, but you can gain back like 30% in certain scenarios. It's things like that where games are factored on the hardware to run that little bit better, which you can do easier on console because it's fixed hardware. But things like VRS, things like FSR, things like DLSS, they're all in heavy demand because it's the final stage of a game. And it's like, what do? Do I wait another 2 months and optimize it, or do I ship it now and use FSR? So you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I do think it's also worth pointing out, and I feel like this always comes up at least once when I compare the Series X and the PlayStation 5. I actually had someone on Broken Silicon who was an Xbox Series X server developer who worked on the server aspects of that APU, that the Xbox Series X was built to be used in servers as well, and so it's built a certain way so that it literally can be used for more than just gaming on a single platform, right? Like there's a reason it's a bit of a bigger die that can allow for more RAM and bandwidth and has all of these checkbox features that you would want in something you're going to use for more than just gaming on a single box at home. Whereas Sony doesn't think about that, and Microsoft wants to use it for all these different things if they're going to spend millions of dollars developing this platform, right? I mean...
Absolutely, yeah, and it's that's the difference in the business model. They've got a very different demand, and Microsoft is pushing very hard. Again, vested interests. They've got their finger and eye on cloud gaming. That's what they want to be. That's what they've always been. They've always been a software solution, not a hardware solution. So their their end game is to get everything over there. So the fact that Series X can, it's not a coincidence that Series X can run 4 instances of an Xbox One title. There you go. That's why the server build exists, because the APU can be dropped into a multi-stacked motherboard in a server rack in a data center, and all of a sudden you've got a very cheap solution that gives you multiple instances of cloud gaming. There's software layers around that as well, but as you say, the APU itself will fundamentally deliver that functionality because it's been designed from the get-go to do it. So that makes sense.
So, all right, I want to jump into this reader mail here. Zabito3 writes, and it says, "Greetings, Tom and NX Gamer. What do you think of modern console pricing when compared to PCs? And do you think that console pricing will go up, stay the same, or go down over the next 2 years?"
It depends. If it's Xbox, it's going to go up because that's bound to happen. Sony did it first. Xbox will do it next because the dollar's not doing great at the moment. So, or at least other currencies are getting better again. So I think the dollar is going to affect them. So yeah, I think Series X and Series S are going to go up. It's just a question of which countries and when. I don't think the PlayStation 5 will go up again. I think what Sony did, they knew they had to, and they put a significant amount in real terms to the individual, but quite small in the great scheme of the hardware. But they did it enough so that if it goes up or down, they at least don't have that risk to have to do it again unless things go drastically wrong. Inflation shouldn't go up to the level where they need to bump it again. So I don't think the PS5 will go up. And in fact, there is a very good chance that the PS5 Slim or whatever it's called when it comes out could be the old price. That could be a target that they're going for. We'll see, because there's definitely some cost reduction.
And you're not talking just about the US, right? When you say prices go up, you're like, well, you're not, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you're saying you're not doubling down if it will necessarily happen in the US or in every country at the same time, but there have been price adjustments in some countries, even if they haven't officially happened in the US yet, right?
Yeah. I think the US is going to be the one that gets hit the least because it's such a big market for both of them. And I don't think it'd be one. If it hits the US, I think it'll be Series X that does it first. I don't see Sony doing it. But to be in reality, I don't see either of them increase the price in the US. Outside of the US, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let me see here. We've already talked about like optimizing like that Dead Space remake. One thing I want to talk about before we get into talking about like future console and PC gaming hardware is one subject that came up a lot when I looked at the last time you were on about a year ago was how eventually things are going to pop up in ports of PC games that eventually the fact that they don't require an SSD that's as fast as the Xbox and certainly not as fast as the PlayStation 5. And, eventually like the fact that you have so many different architectures on PC, like just thinking about like how radically different Pascal, Turing, Ampere/Lovelace, and then GCN, RDNA 1 and 2, and now RDNA 3. You've got 6, and now we have Intel graphics. we have radically different graphics architectures they're all trying to program for on PC. Most PC games still don't require a solid state drive. If they do, they don't really require it to probably be as fast as it should be. And I remember us talking about how eventually that might rear its ugly head. And that eventually you might get these games that have weird performance in certain scenarios that can't just be solved by a faster CPU or GPU. Would you say any of the recent releases we've seen, and I say this because a developer contact of mine pointed this out to me, that he had an unpopular opinion. He thought it would be unpopular, at least if he said it on a show, that a lot of the recent bad ports are a result of devs building games for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X that have a certain minimum speed SSD, minimum amount of threads, and are easy to program for like one model, and that it's not always because it was a bad port. And I have to say that I don't like subscribing to this argument blindly, but a similar thing has popped up where if you don't have a really fast SSD and CPU, when you go to a new area in a lot of recent releases, they're stuttering. Doesn't matter if you have a 4090 in Zen 4, they're still stuttering. Like, how much of this do you think is a result of maybe not enough optimization for recent releases? And how much of this do you think is perhaps devs should just be saying this game really does need like a fast SSD and, a certain amount of RAM because they've been programming for this type of buffer and SSD speed for years now for the next gen consoles?
Well, I've said this before. I said it before the console came out. Yeah, absolutely, it's that. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're making one of the things I mentioned years ago when I did the PS5 video on my channel, I said that the biggest problem that people can't understand is what Sony were building for, and Microsoft have done as well. Is they've built consoles designed to generate and push 4K assets. Now, a lot of the last gen, ignore the Pro and the Xbox One X, there was still generally 4K resolutions at best, but 1080p assets. They weren't genuine 4K textured, authored assets. What we're doing now is we're not only pushing that out the door, but they're also ramping up the effects, the lighting, even ray tracing, all of that. I mean, ray tracing and BVHs is a huge amount of data. So what you've got now is exactly as you say, a lot of data pushing through the system, and the architecture differences between a console and a PC is vast. So GPU, separate pools of RAM, down the PCI Express. You're basically handling multiple heaps and buffers, and you're having to copy back and forth. So what you're seeing now is when people say bad PC ports, they do mean optimization. So no one inherently wants to make a bad port. And at the end of the day, the argument flips. I see this all the time, and it's been a constant argument, which is these consoles are just like PCs until there's a bad PC port, and then it's a bad PC port. Well, if they're just like PCs, why is it bad? And that's because the architecture is different. I've been saying it for years. People seem to ignore it, and it's the fact that you can't have an SSD that can ship. Let's say it's pushing. I mean, the actual throughput isn't the problem. It's the access. It's the fact that it doesn't need to keep that data in RAM. So if we take a PS5, which is the best of both consoles in doing this, because that's what it's inherently designed to do, then for it to take data off an SSD into RAM onto the screen for you to see it, it does all of that effectively without having to touch the CPU. So all of that work is done off chip. It's compressed anyway with bespoke compression, which is using the Kraken system, which you can't do on PC because you can't agree that everyone's going to have it, so that's not possible. So that's the first thing. It's got better compression assets running through, and that's not new. The Dreamcast did that. And then when you get to the hardware, it's got one pool of RAM to worry about, not two. So the CPU and GPU can access the same pool of RAM. So it's just SSD to data. So that's cut the whole point out where you're copying it from SSD to system RAM on PC, then system RAM over to GPU. Look at that. You've got 4 times the amount of data throughput there. And then on top of that, you've got to decompress all that using your CPU. And your CPU is busy running the game. So this is why you see games like Spider-Man, where you turn on ray tracing. It's hammering even the best CPUs you can get in PC space that cost £1,000, but they're barely running the game faster than a 60 FPS PS5 version because that CPU is having to do all this additional work, and it's also stalling on data because it's waiting for it to get from the SSD into RAM. So all you're going to see is, as you say, people are going to say you need to have a certain amount of SSD, and you're going to need a lot more system RAM. But I said this 4 years ago. This was going to happen. And this always happened. Architecture in PC has to update, and it's going to put more pressure on the PC. We're just entering the direct storage. I mean, I covered Forspoken, and that's kind of got carried away. Forspoken doesn't do anything clever. It's not really copying the asset. I mean, the demo that came out, people went mad on it, saying it took less than a second to copy data. Most of that's in system RAM. It's not a genuine copy. The biggest problem is when you're using Forspoken as an example, move the camera when you set things to 4K on a best PC you can get, and the game will drop 30%, 40% of its performance because the game is designed specifically around the PS5. And as Mark Cerny quite clearly called out when he did the demonstration, they've designed it so that you can have all the data you need in RAM and a viewport. And by the time you turn the camera 90 degrees, you've reloaded that next viewport in. PC can't keep up with that, not current spec. So you're going to get what you get, which is stutters.
Well, and it's funny, too, you brought up Spider-Man. While you were talking there, I was pulling up a graph here. Of course, by now we have Zen 4 and Raptor Lake, and soon Zen 4 with Vcache coming out, which will probably get it to decent 120 hertz locked gaming or higher on PC. But a year ago or so, you had the 5800 X3D just rocket up performance by a ridiculous amount, even in 4K, where you would think it wouldn't matter as much as 1080p. And you mentioned accessing data. Isn't it interesting that the CPU that seems to mostly solve the issue in Spider-Man is the one with a ton of cache that makes it easier to access the data, right?
Yeah, exactly. And let's be honest, Spider-Man is probably one of the most optimized games you will ever see on PC because Insomniac are absolutely technical leaders in that sense. So that port is not bad. That port is no way bad in any way, shape or form. And it's been ported by an incredibly talented studio itself. So Nixies know what they're doing. I mean, I've known them since the European demo scene. So they're not an incompetent team. So you've got probably the best 2 teams working on technology, and they didn't give you a bad port. They gave you the exact opposite of that. And like you say, the 5800X just destroys it because I hate that saying. I sound really charged for a sec. But what I mean is it does such a good job in pushing the data through. And that's because it's, as you say, it's designed to keep data local on cache, and that keeps that bandwidth requests down, and therefore you get better performance. You will end up in the next year, with potentially double the performance of the PS5, but it's the cost difference. There's a huge cost difference there.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think you may have said it, but like, what do you think the solution is then for PC? Do you think there's a lot of games here where, like, let me see if I can pull this up. Forspoken minimum requirements for PC. I think, like, 16. Do you think more games should, like, do you think they're kind of like moving things around to try to still support 16 gigabytes of system RAM and like 8 gigabyte graphics cards and like a SATA SSD? Do you think that they should be requiring like an NVMe 3.0 SSD above a certain speed, and that should be in the minimum requirements? They should say, hey, honestly, if you want to avoid stutters, there should be 32 gigabytes of system RAM. Like, is that probably the solution? And if that happened, that would pretty much patch it up, or what do you think?
I think it'll go there, but I think it's a very dangerous game. The marketing part of it you've got to keep in mind, which is the fact that they don't want to alienate a huge portion of the PC market. Can be very volatile. They'll literally boycott a game because it's stupid requirements. But it's going to happen, and it's already happening. You've got the minimum requirements, which people are getting up in arms about. And a lot of games, Forspoken is a good example. Dead Space, Hogwarts Legacy, that was another one that's got quite heavy demands on PC, all for the same reasons. And in fact, that doesn't run very well on the Xbox. I've been looking at it recently, been covering it recently, and it runs quite bad on the Xbox, and it runs okay on the PS5. There's certainly some issues there, but that's a good example of what's easier to shift. I think on PC, it's going to end up, the quickest fixes are more system RAM, because then you can fill it up and copy it across quicker, so you're cutting out a lot of the work. But in reality, it really hangs on them getting the direct storage working that uses GPU decompression in a more efficient way. That's where they're going to have to move to. So you've got both chicken and egg here. You need some software, some hardware. But I'd say in 2 years' time, you're not going to get away without an NVMe drive of at least 3.0, and you're not going to get away with running 4K titles with less than 32 gigabytes system RAM. And I would say 16 to 20 gigabytes of VRAM. Because remember, you always need more on PC to match a console in space, because it's just less efficient.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I remember, I think the first time you were on was in mid-2020, and we talked about, what's going to happen this year, next year, and the following years. And this was all next to a lot of people, both asking before you came on, but especially afterwards. Oh, well, since it was 2020, they're like, should I go buy a 16-core 3950X and, 64 gigabytes of RAM? And should I spend $300 on the fastest SSD I can get right now? And the advice I consistently gave was absolutely not. We can't find any games on PC right now where that makes any difference whatsoever. Save your money now. Build what you need to have now, and it'll probably be fine for 5 years. But just understand that halfway through this console generation, you're probably not going to be gaming at 120 frames as easily anymore. But by then, the stuff that matches the console is going to be half the price. That's when you can buy the next gen stuff. But there's always going to be a point where you need to do that, and I wouldn't buy it early. And there always was going to be an awkward year where it's kind of all over the place as things stabilize and how they solve these problems on PC without hopefully making you buy a $5,000 PC, And I saw people talking about this recently with Forspoken, Hogwarts Legacy. On the previous Broken Silicon, someone asked, is 12 gigabytes going to let me play 4K Ultra most of the time moving forward? And I said, 12 gigabytes is always kind of a mid-range VRAM buffer for the past 3 years. Just because NVIDIA just decided to give the 3080 10 gigabytes doesn't mean they didn't. That was always going to be enough. Like, it is what it is. And, we said you didn't need to upgrade early, but it's 2023, right? Like, we're 3 years into the console gen. We said 3 years ago, there's going to be an awkward year, and that's when you should consider upgrading. And I mean, we're here, right? Like, 3 years, man, time flies.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, this is it. I mean, everyone's got an extra year, I think. The pandemic has caused people to have, developers have missed the boat. There's been delayed games, but this year there's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot of stuff coming out, and it's starting to happen now. You can see it. In fact, the last 3 or 4 releases on PC have all had the same issue. At first, everyone goes on about DirectX 12 stutter. That was never the issue. And in some ways, I think that was a marketing ploy to keep the noise away from the console PC divide. DX12 is an issue in terms of how it handles shaders, or literally in how it hands the power back or the effort back to the developer. It's not quite as controlling for you in terms of state control. So a lot of that work causes this in terms of shader compilation, but also the fact that you're now creating all these shaders, which is a specific code compilation that has to be done dynamically per GPU. That puts a lot of pressure on the developers. So they've basically got to play the entire game, get all the way through it, and render every single shader up front, and then give you that cache locally, so that all of that is pre-built before you get to that stage of doing it. There are games that have it. There are, Callisto Protocol definitely had it at the start. There's other games, even Sony titles. Sackboy had it at the start. So there's definitely, but a lot of the stutters were being mixed up with that, and actually data asset streaming, just general CPU data pausing. And I've covered so many titles over the past few months that have all had that same issue. So yeah, this is it. This is exactly so. This is going to be the year to upgrade, because you're going to see more and more titles coming out that are going to hit that wall quite often, and you're not going to fix it by waiting for a patch, which is like a magical bullet that everyone talks about.
And there will be patches that improve things here and there, but it's not going to be like, I have come to the conclusion, like Hogwarts Legacy, for example, that there's not going to be a magic patch that doubles performance. Might they claw back 10, 20%? Yeah, and I think you've seen new AMD driver updates improve Hogwarts performance, at least on RDNA 2 recently. Like, that type of stuff's going to happen, but I don't think there's like some optimization thing going on here where for PC you can just double performance on it. I don't think it's there. And at the same time, though, I think anyone who's like worried they need to go buy a $2,000 graphics card right now, when I look at, like, I have Forspoken and Harry Potter pulled up, especially with regards to Harry Potter, the people who are actually playing it say the game's fun. I mean, I looked at like what you need for 4K 60 or 4K 45 and stuff, and it doesn't need a 4090 to do 4K 60, like it mostly ultra. And then if you turn on DLSS or FSR, you're getting close to 100 anyways. I think that's, it's just accept that this game is never going to run 4K 200, right? Without some insane PC. But I don't think we're at this point where it's like Dark Souls 1, where like you can't even get 30 frames. Like Hogwarts, turn down a few settings, turn on FSR, you're fine. And I think that if you're willing to wait, I'm pretty sure the stuff coming out at the end of this year and early next year, I keep hearing about all these accelerators AMD's putting into their CPUs, and presumably Intel will as well. Like, I think we're going to see a thing where they have the solution to the problem in a year anyways. It's just, yes, there's just this year where you can't game 4K 60 on your old $400 graphics card without turning down a couple things. But it is what it is, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's hardware solutions with the software catching up. So the stuff that's happening in the background that will, like I say, direct storage, you just keep your eye on that. You're going to see a lot of things move towards that as a solution. And it's all around, ironically, offloading the work away from the dedicated hardware to specific hardware, so that the CPU, GPU is free to do the work when it needs to. That's going to happen a lot. But it also just around the performance. I think the problem is, you can run Hogwarts, like you can run all these titles, right? Like Dead Space, you can run over 120 FPS. I was at 180 FPS. The problem isn't the performance; it's when it's accessing data in big chunks, it stutters, and it's why I talk about frame time so much, because frame rate to me is irrelevant. Frame rate is kind of the byproduct of frame time, as you know, but it's all around that, and that's what people feel. So when you're playing the game and you walk into a room and it stutters for 120, 30 milliseconds 3 times in the space of 30 seconds, that feels horrible. But if you run a game at 45 FPS consistently and it's consistently hitting 25, 23 milliseconds per frame, that doesn't feel as bad. It's when things pause and stop and start that feels terrible. And that's what's hitting PC now often. It's that chugging, because effectively it's just stalling all the time. And no hardware is going to fix it. It's got to be fixed between new hardware and better changes to the engine itself to better suit the PC architecture, which is, like I say, fundamentally split pools of RAM and no dedicated hardware to offload to.
Yeah, hopefully there's some update they can do though for that, because that just sucks, right? If you're basically telling people it's gonna be limited to like 45 frame drops for the next year. Like, hopefully there's something they could do where, I think we've seen this in some recent game releases like Call of Duty, where they're like, yeah, the solution is we can just use 20 gigabytes of RAM. It'd be nice if that was at least an option for the people that have that much RAM.
And I think that'll happen. And also lower textures. I always say to everyone all the time, if you're struggling, lower the texture assets, lower your texture buffers from ultra to high or medium. Yeah, Forspoken is a good classic example. You can't run Forspoken on 8 gig. Yeah, it's definitely got optimization issues in quotes where it just doesn't handle its heaps very well. But if you lower texture resolution, that's going to claw back so much VRAM that gives your other heaps more space if they dynamically allocate that based on the hardware. So that's always a quick fix for PC. Run it at 1440p, but drop your resolution to low and then try the game. I bet everyone gets better performance, less stutters, because you're just pushing less data through the system.
Yeah, I did notice that too, all the way back in Battlefield 2142 within RTX 3070. Like, in the beta, I could do 4K 100 at mostly ultra pretty dang well, even with just 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But I noticed in the full game, especially if I played through several maps, eventually it went from using 6 gigabytes to 7 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes to 8.5 on an 8 gigabyte 3070. And I just said, I mean, I can find scenarios and there are some evenings where there's no stuttering at ultra textures. But if I drop this to high or medium textures, it never stutters all of a sudden. And I think people get misleaded, their expectations do, when they'll go to like Tech Power Up or other benchmarking websites, and they will benchmark VRAM usage, and they'll say, see, this game runs fine with 8 gigabytes. And it's like, well, it runs fine for 5 minutes in your benchmark run. And some reviewers have noticed this and pointed this out, though. But I think people get these expectations where they're like, well, it should be doing ultra. The reason it doesn't on mine is it's like, honestly, you probably want to be using, and some games limit it now. Like, I noticed Horizon on PC has a setting that limits it. I think Call of Duty might have a setting that limits it for you, where they will just try to never use more than like 80% of your VRAM buffer because they know it's smoother. And some games don't have that toggle. You manually do it yourself, turn it down one setting, and it'll probably in long-term gaming sessions have way less stuttering, right? That's it. I mean, in short terms, it's page swapping. That's what's happening. So you end up with temporary buffers moving data back and forth. It just kills your performance dead. So the best thing to do is have at least a little bit of overhead, because memory management is hard, even for my day job in data centers. But in a game in something as demanding as a game, you're dynamically allocating data all the time, or at least you don't want to. But you have dynamic heaps. You're constantly juggling data back and forth, and memory is always in demand all the time. So if it's not in memory, you're screwed. And that's happening a lot, and it's going to happen a lot more because of just where the game assets are going, engines are going. And Unreal Engine 5 is I've said this before on another podcast. It's ubiquitous in the terms of everyone's using it, but that's not always a good thing, because what people will see, it's why you get this thing like Unity is really crap. Unity is not bad. Unity is a tool like any other tool, but if it's free and it's easy access and there's loads of online marketplaces, what you're going to get? You're going to get a lot of people jumping on making a game that don't really have the experience, and then you end up with bad games. So you can't do that with Guerrilla's engine, Decima, or Kojima's engine. That is what used to be Fox Engine, but those are behind closed doors, and they're managed by a team that understands it and developed by a team that understands it. Unreal Engine and Unity are just out there. Just grab your tools, have a go. Yeah, you think about the Decima engine, right? And you're like, man, this engine seems so good. And you're like, well, let's see who's using the Decima engine. Kojima and Guerrilla. And you're like, well, yeah, but they're also the most competent developers, so I'm sure it looks good, Exactly.
There's definitely a combination of both. People always talk about engines a lot, and I do it as well, but you can't underestimate the talent behind the engine. And that's a big, big thing. And Guerrilla are absolutely pinnacle of technology. So some of the stuff they're doing at the moment in terms of how they develop games, and that's what I love. A lot of that gets pushed to the side, but a lot of the data center stuff that's going on, that's a big part in making games efficient in terms of check-in, online solutions, dynamic compilation, being able to run the same version across multiple nodes so that multiple people can just submit their version, compile it and play it dynamically and live on remote servers. All of that is where the future is going, and engines that support that are big. I mean, I'm getting off topic, but that's a big development area for a lot of companies, and I think Guerrilla have invested heavily in that. I looked at one of their papers the other week, and it was really, very interesting. Probably not to the mainstream, but for me, as a geek, it's good.
Well, I mean, this is a channel of mostly geeks who are following us, so if there's ever a time to talk about it, it's hopefully with this crowd, but all Jesse wants for Valentine's Day is to get a hold of one of them geese and maybe get some extra naps in. But if you're a gamer like me and you're building a new PC, you probably just want reasonably priced Microsoft keys, and if so, go to cdkeyoffer.com this Valentine's Day. This piece of content is brought to you by cdkeyoffer.com. There's just no reason to pay exorbitant monopolistic prices for Microsoft Office or Microsoft operating systems anymore. Not when you have someone like cdkeyoffer.com, who's been a fantastic sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead for many years now. If you're looking for anything from Steam games, Origin games, Uplay games, or PlayStation keys, or reasonably priced Microsoft software, go to cdkeyoffer.com today, click the links in the description, and use the offer codes BrokenSilicon for 25% off Microsoft keys and DieShrink for 3% off everything else on the website. Don't be like Jesse here, who's chewing on my chair right now. Be smart, don't overpay for online software, and go to cdkeyoffer.com today. Moving forward a little bit here, so we've talked a lot about what's going on with PC, like where that's going in the next year or so. Like, just point blank, the consoles, PlayStation, Xbox, how are you feeling about them right now? Do you think that it's smooth sailing, that they're going well? And of course, it could be different answers for different consoles. Do you think that they're showing their age at all, really? And are there any trends that have emerged or failed to emerge, whether it's image quality, frame rate settings, gamer, like, how is this generation going? Is it going well? And is anything different than what you expected, you know?
I think it's going very well. I think it's going much better for Sony because they've put their investment in the right place and they've handled it very well. I think Xbox have done okay at the start. I think that I've said this before. Their last year was just a car crash, just terrible. They didn't release anything. I've never known it. So they're not having a good year, and I think that's kind of borne out by the fact that they've bought some publishers and they're trying to push their market that way. So in terms of Xbox, no, I don't think last year's gone very well at all, and I think they know.
Would you say it's going better than last gen for them, though?
Yes, I think certainly in terms of image share and market share, yes, I think they're doing okay. I wouldn't say they're selling gangbusters, but I think they're doing well in terms of managing the market, the fan base, and giving people what they want. I mean, Game Pass has saved them, in my opinion. It's kept them on the tip of people's tongues all the time because of Game Pass. If it wasn't for Game Pass, you probably wouldn't talk about Xbox much. That's the thing. And I think that's where you've got to give them kudos. They saw a market and they grabbed it and they've done a good job there. So I think that's where Xbox are. And I've said this before, their market's changed. It's not the same market as Sony. So I think that's Xbox. They need to deliver games this year. And I think they've got that hopefully in hand with lots of stuff lined up. I mean, I'm itching to play Starfield. That's my big title for them. So I can't wait to play that because I'm a sci-fi geek as well. But I think Forza looks good. So I think for Xbox, I've never been a fan of the Series S. I get why they've done it, but I still think that's a bit of a noose around their neck, which is probably going to bite them a little bit later on down the line, if not now. Because I mean, it just doesn't run anything. Everything's turned off. Every game I've
heard a lot of developers say that too, that they're really concerned about optimizing games for the Xbox Series when they have like a 10 gigabyte RAM limit on the Series S that they have to support.
Yeah, and that's why you're going to get silly frame rate, silly resolutions and texture assets. I mean, Dead Space is another example that it really suffers when VRS is on because of that RAM pool and everything's so low. You're talking 720p often in that title for a next-gen console without ray tracing. So it's definitely, in my opinion, too low. I can't believe they passed that. You know, we're releasing a brand new console that's weaker than our last one, the Xbox One X, just madness. But anyway, CPU aside, it is. So I think that's Xbox, and I think they this year is make or break for them in terms of market. I think that their fan base will fall out if they don't deliver on things like Starfield and things like Forza, and potentially if they show something in Fable. So they're the big ticket titles, I think, for this year, which will be good, and it will help Game Pass. For Sony, I think that they've had a bad year, only in the sense of I don't think they released what they thought they could release last year. So I think there's a lot of stuff stacked up for this year that they're going to stagger out.
Like Factions is an example of that, right? Like, I'm just shocked that's not out yet.
Yeah, well, they're investing heavily in online, but again, Sony want to make everything great. So I think that's one of their problems, that they give developers the time, and I think that's also means that people get frustrated. So yeah, Factions not being out is kind of, I definitely think that's missed its original deadline a couple of times, but that will land this year. I'm almost sure of it. I think the target was to release it. I would be amazed if it wasn't targeted to release around the show, but for whatever reason they've missed it. But the hype's worked well on that. So I think that's always been Sony's aim. They've done well in terms of making Sony Studios a Disney of the game channel. They're trying to make this Hollywood style, and that's worked with the TV show. And I think they'll push that more with God of War. So I think there'll be definitely more titles this year that we'll see from Sony, some exclusives, and certainly some limited exclusives or timed exclusives. We're going to see more of that. Me and you spoke before about the Metal Gear Solid one. I'm not breaking any rules, but that's I've heard that from multiple people, as have you, for years. So there's no way that's not in development.
I was gonna have that on the script, but there was already a pretty long amount of conversation points that we have to get to, but you brought it up, so I'm bringing it up again. I haven't asked anyone about it in the past 6 months, but I guess I won't say who, but I'm friends with multiple podcasts that have good friends with developers at Sony. They all say there's a Metal Gear Solid game, and to this day, I don't know if I've just been gaslit by 20 different people at the same time or what, because where the hell is the Metal Gear Solid remake? But you're saying it without me again. That's coming. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I've heard it from a couple of people. Yes, it's supposed to be well known and out there, and I don't know.
And this is recent. As of recently, you've heard this again.
As of in the last 6 months or so, I've heard that it's still in the pipe. Yeah, so there's definitely something out there. Whether it comes out this year, but that's one. And then there's a lot of other stuff. I know there's a big title from Firesprite. I know that they've just done a great job with Horizon Core of the Mountain, but they've certainly been very active in the VR market, and they're built from a class studio anyway, from prior to Psygnosis. That's where a lot of them came from, at least the founders, and then Imagine from before that. So they've potentially got something big in the VR space coming, which is meant to be incredible, and that's something that I think will come out or at least be shown off this year. But I think Sony just need to keep their consistency up. A lot of people give them flack, I think, for being quiet, but I disagree. I like what they do, because I think it does this calm before the storm. Because what Sony have got is they've got a captive audience. So Sony can be quiet, and everyone talks about them being quiet. So they kind of win-win, don't they? Because even when they're not doing anything, they're getting spoke about for not doing anything. So they do all the right things. And I think the only thing that I am surprised in is they've not done a massive marketing push for PSVR2. And I think that's an amazing piece of kit. But I hope they ramp that up over the next few months, just to really push how good that is, because I think it's kind of breaking that level of I wouldn't say mainstream, but it's certainly breaking the barriers down of entering VR for a lot of people that you definitely would have had for PSVR 1. But so just summarising what I've said, I think Xbox had a terrible year last year, no doubt about it. Then they really need to perform this year. I think Sony did a good job in keeping things ticking over with some great releases, even if not all of them landed. But I think this year they've got a lot in the pipe, and I think they both need to push the wow factor of next-gen gaming that we want. So I think that's what a lot of people expect this year, but I think we're going to see it. We'll see it in certainly on the Sony side, potentially I'm hoping on the Xbox side with a couple of titles. Starfield should be a great game, but whether it's a technical masterpiece, come on, we know who the developer is.
Well, all right. So I was going to move to PSVR 2 next, but I do have these other notes here about Microsoft Studios. So you brought up Starfield again, so I do want to touch on that one more time before I move forward. I'll just say this openly. I haven't really done, I don't believe, any big leak of, I think I talked about it a little bit on Recent Broken Silicon, but I recently had a couple of my better developer sources warn me that Starfield may be in trouble. Now, this is one of those things where it's like, you got to be so careful. I mean, the Metal Gear Solid remake thing is a good example of being careful about leaking information about games. It's like these things can have one person in a studio say one thing, he's having trouble with this thing, but really the overall game's turning out great, or the opposite could be going on. You can have games where it's supposed to come out that year and it doesn't come out for 4 years. Where's Hellblade 2, by the way? I spontaneously started laughing the other day when I realized, wait, wasn't that like a thing they showed off early 2020? Where is Hellblade 2? It's very hard to nail down. You should always be second guessing if you have the full picture when talking about upcoming game releases, much more than talking about upcoming hardware releases. They're just so hard to nail down. But like, I heard Starfield may actually have a lot of issues and a lot of recent layoffs, and that there's a lot of turmoil just in general at Bethesda Studios. So I'm just wondering if you have a lot of confidence that Starfield's going to turn out well. Because, I mentioned this information in much more detail than I think I want to say publicly right now to my co-host Broken Silicon, Dan, and he was pretty depressed. He's like, we want Starfield to turn out well. I think more than him actually, Fallout. He liked Skyrim a lot. I don't want Starfield to be bad, but like, I guess I'm asking because I'm selfishly want you to tell me that everything's okay. Is everything okay with Starfield? Because the stuff I was told was like very bad. I don't want to get into details, but it was bad. Do you think but have you heard differently?
I had to be fair. I haven't heard what state it's in directly. I just know what I've seen, and it doesn't look. What they showed off as a vertical slice, for whatever, for want of a better description, was not great. There was some good stuff in there, but the problem is they're still using the same engine, and therefore they're still going to be limited by the similar issues, which is basically patch it to make it work for the team are talented and they make some great games, really involved RPG games. I can't fault them for that, but mismanagement is generally a term thrown around a lot, but it's a big problem with Microsoft, simply because they don't give studios autonomy where needed. And they do a lot of and Sony have done this. Sony did this with the PS3 famously, when they took people's development, pre-renders as a sales pitch to get greenlit on a studio for a game and then push that public at E3. That's what Microsoft do a lot. So they show, like Hellblade 2 is a good example of that. They acquired Ninja Theory. They went out and did a presentation. Ninja Theory had something, or at least they got a short ask to make something. There's no way that game that they showed off Hellblade 2 was anything more than just a cinematic. And I get that. Everyone's done that. It's been done. Sony have done it. Everyone's guilty of that. It's not a new thing. But Microsoft do it all the time because they're consistently trying to create hype. So what they do is they fall on their own sword all the time because they keep doing it. And I think Starfield is another good example of it. They held it back and then they showed it off when they weren't ready. So I think the problem they've got now is they've created an expectation that is going to be hard to meet. I would be amazed. I mean, one thing I've heard from Starfield is it's 4K 30, which is going to annoy people.
On Series X.
Yeah. So that's
hopefully that changes, by the way. But and I'm sorry I'm cutting you off, but do you think if that happens, because before the Series X and PS5 came out, Ubisoft announced that Assassin's Creed Valhalla was going to be 4K 30, and then everyone got mad and they're like, never mind, dynamic resolution 60, and it turned out pretty well, actually. It was generally above 1440p on both consoles. I mean, on Xbox, I think it was usually above 60. I mean, it was great. It worked great. Do you think this is an example of this is their target now and they can change it? Or do you think this is an example of kind of like last gen, frankly, where it's like, yeah, honestly, guys, these games are running at 30 frames because that Jaguar CPU ain't doing 60. Do you think there's something where it's just bogged down and they might as well target 30? Or do you think that could change? Or what would be your guess? And I'm sorry I cut you off. Please continue after.
No, it's fine. Again, this is guess. I don't know anything. But looking at their engine and how the Game Bro and whatever engine titles they keep giving it are, but the engine itself can be very CPU limited, certainly single thread limited, multiple. That's one area they've got to work on. The problem with that is there's a lot of work to make very multi-threaded engine technology across a title such as Starfield, because effectively they're going for the No Man's Sky, but on a much bigger scale because everything's going to be handmade, hand-authored. I know there's procedural generation and all that kind of stuff, but generally it's going to be a higher level of polish than that. That's hard. So I think the fact that they're saying 4K 30 is they're CPU bound. I think that's where their limit is. So it doesn't matter what resolution they're going to go to. Whether they can get to a point of offering that, and I think the get out of jail free will be, here's a 60 FPS mode that relies on VRR, and you might be somewhere in the 40s. So I'm not saying it's the end of the world, and trust me, I'm not that bothered about 60 FPS as probably many people think I am on my channel. But what is important is they've always released titles that underperform on console and even PC on day one. So they need to break that rule.
You mean the Bethesda Studios?
Yeah, generally, yeah. I mean, I'm not talking about id Tech here, so they're a very different beast. But in terms of Starfield, Fallout, Skyrim, they all performed terribly on the original consoles they were targeted for because they just ran badly on the hardware, and then later on hardware came faster and they got away with it. I think this is a case of that again, where they bite off more than they can chew, and they try and make a game fit on a Series X when actually they need to spend more time with their engine being multi-threaded. I don't know, but I think that's where their problems are going to be. So I think you're going to end up with a very potentially a game that performs badly in certain areas because it's not GPU bound, because it's CPU bound, because they're doing so much simulation with the combat and everything else that's going on in that title, because they have a very good target base that they want to make. And there are passionate people in that studio that make the games, because you can tell that by how much effort they put into the games. It's just that they're working to a remit that has to deliver so much content, which I hate that word, and so many hours of gameplay. They can't focus on fixing things because they've got to focus on filling the game. So that's going to be one big area. And also, I think they've got a lot of feedback from the original reveal. Just having pre-scripted landings and takeoffs. That's just a no-go in this day and age. I can't believe they thought they'd fly. So you've got to look at warning signs like that when you see the fact that it's Todd Howard. So Todd Howard is a used car salesman through and through. So you're getting what he's selling you, but is what he's selling you really a great car for that price? Probably not. And I think that's the problem with Starfield. It's got a lot of weight on its shoulders, both from us, the fan base wanting to play a game, because I'm really looking forward to it, but also the fact that they've never shipped a very good performing title ever that I know on console in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I remember Fallout 4, which I loved that one. I think that's actually kind of against the grain a little bit, how much I like that one compared to what people would usually say. But I remember, I think I had it was a really good overclocker. It was a Vega 64. I remember standing on top of that airship in the city, and I called my brother over. I'm like, hey, Dan, come here and look at this. And he's like, what? So I'm looking over this side of the boat, and I am getting 100 frames a second. For this side of the boat, I'm getting 60. Does this part of the city look any harder to run than this side? And he's like, no. And it's like, and I can't see any enemies for that far away. Why is the frame rate half as big here? What is doing this? Oh, no. And it's that type of thing where I'm like, well, I wonder if if there is a limit, or if the frame rate is all over the place. Like, my guess is they all feel compelled to ship with an unlocked frame rate option, just for marketing purposes, to say with VRR you can hit 60. But I wonder if they just run into that so much that they don't see a point in certainly pushing to 120 or something.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't think that's a title that's going to benefit anyway. And I think even 4K, I think coming out at 1440p with much better levels of interaction, simulation, world building, detail, character models, all of that is far more important than resolution and frame rate. I've always said that. But I will stick by the fact that you need consistency in frame time. That's the problem. And I think they just have a tendency to create games that fluctuate heavily. Lock 30 is fine. I can live with it. I think most people can. Lock 60 is better, obviously. It's when you're all over the place, as you say, it just feels horrible. And that is one problem I've got. But the other problem I've got is it doesn't deliver on expectations. I really hope they don't half-arse it, which is, we promised you this world. We promised you No Man's Sky, but on a Hollywood budget. And then
But that's what I'm worried about, right? Because Microsoft kind of needs a big release.
Yeah,
they need it now. And I wonder that they're going to push them to release it before it's ready. And this is just one of those studios where they sometimes take a decade to make a game. I'm not defending them, by the way, for taking a decade to make a game, but they seem like they need that usually. And but Microsoft needs a game now. It's It's kind of getting a bit dire there. I mean, I don't know that I'm going to read any of them. I have all these reader mails here that are basically asking, what do you think's going on at Xbox Studios? Because I don't know where their games are. They have all these studios. I know some of them are always going to take longer to release. But again, then I can point out Hellblade 2 and I go, where are the games, Microsoft? You bought all these studios.
Well, again, it brings me back to my same point. Mismanagement. The problem with big companies is there's never one person managing it. Even though you see the person on the front, it doesn't come from one person, especially some companies big as Microsoft. So you've probably got a lot of plans behind the scene that said, you know what, we'll start this generation, we'll do cloud gaming, we'll do Game Pass, we'll buy a few publishers, and by 2023, we'll have 40% of the market because online gaming is going to be absolutely the top thing. Everyone's going to be playing cloud and everyone's going to be at home because of the pandemic. All that will work out for us. It didn't. A lot of people didn't subscribe to Game Pass at the level they thought. There's not as much revenue there, which they've obviously had to come out and admit now that what we already knew, which is the fact that it doesn't make you money because you're
and I did look up recently, by the way, this came out like a few months ago that and they haven't hit the subscriber number targets they wanted to 2 years in a row now. So there is something here where they really haven't got the subscriber level they think they need for it to be profitable and sustainable. This has emerged it really isn't like a speculation thing. It still really hasn't hit the popularity they're hoping for 2 years in a row.
No, and some of that's their own fault. Some of that is the fact that, as you say, they haven't shipped anything. You've got no reason to own Game Pass other than the fact you don't want to pay £40, £70 for a game. But you're still paying £10 or £11 or $15 a month or whatever it is. The end game is always the same. So, and Microsoft are no different to anybody else. Just you can use any subscription model you want. They'll hook you, and then they either divvy up the market, so they divvy up the categories and say medium tier, and they've done that already. Mm-hmm. So and then on top of that, they then start doing other things by putting the price up, or they start releasing games in episodic, and therefore you've got to subscribe. So if you don't subscribe, you can only play part 1, you can't play part 2. So that's their end game, and that's always been Microsoft's end game and everyone's end game in terms of getting subscriptions. The problem with Microsoft is they don't commit to things for long enough. And I'm not saying this blindly. I've known and worked with Microsoft for years. I mean, I've worked with them back in the 90s. They've got history of doing this time and time again. And Google are the same. Big companies always do it because they're targeted on year yields. They're not targeted on long-term goals. So they'll flip on a dime, so to speak. But they are a massive ship. They can't turn on it. So that the problem is that internally they'll chase the golden ticket, and externally it looks like, what the hell are they doing? It's because internally they've cancelled 50 projects. We just don't know it. And I think that's Microsoft's problem. They don't invest and stick to something. Like, for example, if Microsoft had funded and pushed something like Forspoken, which I think did actually quite well in the end, but I think the general push was, this doesn't look great, people aren't getting excited about it, the buzz is not there, they probably would have backed out of it earlier on and not shipped the game, whereas that's not Sony's MO. They just don't do that. So that's, I think, where Microsoft are paying the price. They don't stick and commit to things often enough, or they react or overreact to the market. So they'll panic and think, we can't release that now because everyone's saying this, don't release it. But you can't keep mothballing stuff without it having an impact on your bottom line and obviously having an impact on your public relations. And I think both those things have come true. So I think the publishing deal is just a case of we need to get the whole market away from anyone else so that we own it in Game Pass. And that's what the buyouts are for. Basically, if you can't build it, buy it.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I saw that this episode will actually drop, I believe, like the day of or after when Microsoft is arguing at a court in the EU, I believe, to try to keep the deal going. I don't know. That one doesn't look like it's going to happen, does it?
It doesn't. I mean, I've not talked about it much. I've had opinions on it, but I did say it from the start it wouldn't happen. I mean, I said I did a video on the day when Google announced they were shutting down Stadia, and I said the first thing they're going to do is they're not going to do it yet, but they'll jump in bed and say they support Sony and agree that Microsoft are a conglomerate, and that's what they've done. And that was exactly what they did. It was obvious because they're just repaying the favour that Microsoft did to them, because Microsoft want the mobile market. So I think that the problem is that the UK monopolist law has basically come in to say, and you can't disagree with them. People say that I'm not invested in the deal. It doesn't make any difference to me. I don't know why people get invested in it, but
I know. Yeah, me neither.
There's some
I don't have stocks in any of these companies.
I know, it's just crazy. People getting very passionate about whether they win or die by buying Activision, but realistically, what they've put forward is exactly logical, and they know what Microsoft are doing. They've basically said, absolutely, guys, have at it. If you want Call of Duty, you can buy Call of Duty. We're not going to stop you. You just can't own the marketplace and also own all of this cloud market. And they want King. That's what Microsoft are after. They want Activision for King, for all that lovely market share of the mobile market, because then they can jump onto Apple. Then they can jump onto Google Play. That's what they're going for. And that's what I said years ago. That's their end game. So I don't see this deal going through because they're not really interested in the Call of Duty thing. And they know, everyone knows it. And that's why they've said, well, if you want it, you can split it up. You can sell it in chunks, or you can just buy Activision and take out the Call of Duty stuff and sell the rest on. But you can't have it all. So, yeah, I think it's going to really struggle because it's gotten pretty far. It will definitely stall it for a while, I think, at best.
Yeah, and it's not the same as like the NVIDIA ARM thing where like if NVIDIA doesn't get ARM within 5 years, you might as well not get it because like if you don't have the latest technology, the advantages you get just aren't there. Taking 10 years to get game studios might be worth waiting it out. But I do think that there has to be some ticking clock there, though, where it's just not worth worrying, like bogging down for that many years. And on top of that, actually, something I've thought about is, they made this deal for Activision-Blizzard at the peak of a booming market, and we're in a recession now. And I've heard about, I don't know how many high-profile cases there are of this, but there's still hundreds of $million deals between some companies recently that I heard were canceled. And the company gave all these reasons for why they didn't meet some requirement and they had to cancel this deal. And then it turned out, though, behind the scenes, it seems like they just didn't want to buy the share price at what they agreed to 2 years ago anymore because the company's worth a fourth as much as it used to be. And I do wonder, depending on how this recession goes, how much Microsoft might go, we paid a lot for Activision Blizzard and their stock price, and I don't know if their company is really worth that much anymore. We may have overpaid and taken forever to get something, and they may. I wonder if they'll be more happy to back out of it soon, just simply for that reason alone.
They could be, but I think they'll back out of it because I do think this is definitely a bit make or break for the Xbox platform. I've said it for a few years. I think that Microsoft. I'm old enough to remember that Microsoft have abandoned a lot of stuff that people probably wouldn't have thought now they would have abandoned. They're long since forgotten. So they've definitely got a history of doing this, but I think the writing's on the wall. If you look at their year-on-year earnings this year, their earnings call is very bad. As you said, that they didn't make their targets for Game Pass. It's not making them money. It's a loss leader. Their revenue stream has dropped, and revenue is not profit, because everyone goes on about that incorrectly online and saying that revenue is irrelevant if you're spending as much more than you're pulling in. But in addition to that, Windows isn't selling like it used to. It doesn't make them the money it used to. Their cloud and Azure, which I know firsthand has done well, but it's still not AWS. It's still not in killing them dead. And so even though it's a good market for them, it's almost shrunk, and there's other people coming into that market that are battling them. And Microsoft have had some issues in the last 12 months. They've had a lot of demand. Teams has done well for them, and Teams has been a big demand, but they've had a lot of issues in Teams. They've had a lot of issues that have hit a lot of areas in one go, and that's tainted their image again because the demand's high and they can't deliver. So I think Microsoft have got a problem. Like you said, a ticking time bomb is right. They've definitely got an issue with Xbox. They've got to deliver something. If they let Activision go or they give up on the deal, I think that's around the fact that they just can't keep pushing money into this, because right now it's a waste of time, effort, and money, and this isn't going to cost them nothing. But they can certainly afford it for a period of time. But the biggest giveaway is the fact that for this year they're not doing any E3, and that's unheard of for them, because they can't keep affording winning millions of pounds when they're not making any money. So somebody somewhere up the food chain has gone, do you know what, guys? Your marketing budget's being cut. And that's what's happened. And they've got to deliver. So if this Activision deal falls through, I think there's definitely going to be more changes at Xbox. And that might mean some of the diversification of their platform. I mean, look at all the marketing they've done. You got the Xbox hats, Xbox drinks, Xbox gloves, everything. And
Xbox fridge.
Yeah, Xbox fridge. I thought that was cool, though. To be fair, that was a genius move. They did really well.
I think it looks cool, and it really embraces the name. It's a good idea.
Yeah, it's good. But again, that's because you need the merch and all that. You need it, and I think that's what Xbox need. They need to keep the buzz going because right now they haven't got the games to do it. So I do think there's definitely a time limit on how long Xbox will last, and they're not going to all of a sudden jump back to the Xbox we knew in the 360 era, which they were unbelievable, but a completely different delivery team then that delivered that console.
All right. So I think, a lot of companies are cutting their marketing budgets right now, though, too. Like when I heard about all these layoffs at Intel, one thing I was told is the number one team getting gutted is the marketing division. And I think for good reason on that company. But, I don't think it should surprise us if any of these companies start dialing down their marketing to save money. I'm frankly, I have a predilection to think that a lot of companies maybe spend too much on marketing. I don't think it's always a waste. Like I think the Xbox fridge is a good idea and worth whatever they spent, but I can't help but think that half of the ads I see appearing, I'm like, did they pay $1 million to get that placement? Is that really going to make them $1 million? I don't know. But I think you also said that PlayStation VR2 had less of a push than you were expecting as well. And I'm going to change the lights for this subject. I actually feel bad because I forgot to change the color of the lights in the podcast up until now. But honestly, I was just enjoying the conversation so much. I apologize to everybody. but one of the main reasons we had you on was that you have PlayStation VR2 early. And this is dropping, right on the release day in the UK so that we can, discuss this when it's coming out. I have to talk about it though. What are your thoughts on PlayStation VR2? Do you think it should have had, like I brought it up, do you think it should have had a bigger marketing push? Do you think and just how would you summarize its place in the market right now? Because I looked it up and I read about what's out already before we started recording, and look, it's better than PlayStation VR1, but it still uses Move controllers. That's a pretty old device. Like, how would you summarize how well their launch is going now, and just your opinions on it as well relative to its competition?
Well, as I said, I think that the marketing on it, I think Sony have pulled back on their marketing for a few years now. They pulled out of E3 years ago, and I think that was clever. They've got, it's much better to control the narrative, which is what they do with their directs. So the fact they got the state of play is the easiest way to show it off. Here's a big session, everyone tunes in, captive audience, perfect. So that's coming for PSVR2, pretty sure of it. But I don't. Yeah, they haven't advertised it much, but they have given it to a lot of channels, a lot of tech channels, and I think that's a good way to create buzz, and it's an easier way to create buzz because it gets out to so many different markets that you can't get when you go to a marketing company. As you say, it's
probably far more cost effective, right, to give a VR device to 100 YouTube channels than buying a Super Bowl ad.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also it's a more focused target because the audience tuning in are inherently interested in PSVR. So there's no point in selling it to a guy who watches football who's going to go, "What the hell is this white helmet for? Put me back to the football." So it's all relative, isn't it? So all of that makes sense. So in terms of marketing, yeah, I did expect a bigger push, but again, they did the same thing with God of War. There wasn't really much, and then all of a sudden when it came out, they had loads of advertising everywhere. So that is one of the things they do. They hit it on the nail in terms of timing. We'll probably see a lot more come out of it, and certainly there's some good games on there, certainly games that I've played and games that are coming out soon, and one I've just literally got as we were talking, so I can hopefully dive into that at some point tomorrow. But in terms of the hardware, it's absolutely... a huge, I've said this in my review, it's a generational leap over PSVR. In so many ways, it's not the same. So if you're coming from the PSVR, this is absolutely transformative in every single shape, way, and form. From all the wires that are gone, no camera, the connectivity, the simplicity, all of that. But also in terms of the PC market, yeah, technically, it's not going to offer a huge technological leap over something like, I use a Rift S, but if you're using like the Valve Index or whatever, they're all pretty similar. You need a high level PC and you need a pretty good PC. Let's be honest. To beat the PS5 in VR titles, you're going to need a decent PC, and I'm talking 3070 levels or 6800 levels, that kind of spec. So you're not going to need a cheap PC. But on top of that, the headset, it's got one of the highest resolutions out there. Not the highest, but it's not just the resolution. It's
not like the Pimax, but among the mainstream devices, it's maybe the highest of the mainstream ones, are close.
It is, yeah, it's borderline, but it's also cheaper. So it's cheaper than, I mean, okay, with the Quest 2, but that's kind of technology that you're not going to use unless you've got a PC to plug it in. But it's cheaper than anything that's better than it by a considerable margin, probably a few £100, which is not a few $100. But also, its optics, its entire presentation is excellent. One of the things that I always struggle with VR is you still get that telescopic look when you're putting it on. So you've got that single cone black peripheral vision part. This isn't gone in the PSVR2, but it's certainly, you're able to adjust it, push it further to your head, get a much comfier fit. You don't get hardly any light leakage now because of the gill thing they've got. So that's really, really good. And that makes it sounds silly, but that makes an impact in VR because you are trying to just create this, I'm in this world. The quality and the sharpness of the image is great, but it's an OLED image with HDR. Now, that is one of the big impacts you'll see in many titles. They look far more vibrant. Jump to the PSVR, jump to even the Rift S. That's an LED screen. It just doesn't have the pop, doesn't have the colors, doesn't have the blacks. So a lot of the stuff you see instantly looks a bit washed out. Whereas in the PSVR 2, a lot of the newer stuff, Horizon Call of the Mountain is a good example, but so's Kayak VR, Mirage, Kayak Mirage VR, that's good. Moss looks incredible in it. So they've improved image quality both in the headset itself, the resolution, the optics, and also the OLED screen makes a huge amount of difference. The fact that it can push field of view out is one of the biggest changes you'll get as well. Not so much in PC, because you used that anyway, but in certainly PSVR, because a lot of the titles are like twice the depth in terms of the same title for title, in terms of the field of view. That makes it less claustrophobic. Everything looks easier and it looks more realistic, but you can scale so well. But the biggest function benefit it's got, in my opinion, is you can literally turn your console on, turn your headset on, and be into a VR game in the same speed you get into a standard game. You literally stick the helmet on your head and you're good to go.
Yeah, and you really couldn't with PSVR 1. I mean,
God, no.
Logically, you could argue you could because it's a console, but I'm going to be honest, like there were so many cables and stuff that it was just absolutely absurd, right? And it kind of ruined the advantages you have with click and play of a console.
Yeah, absolutely. All that is gone here. It's so much simpler. Yeah. Ideal is no cable, but there's two reasons why you need it. One, the quality of the video feed just wouldn't be good enough in wireless. I'm sure they use wireless in some way, shape or form with the cameras and everything else, but they definitely need the cable for the power because there's no battery, that would add weight, and they need it for the feed. So the cable's there. It's like 4.5 meters. It never got in my way. I haven't got the biggest room in the world, but it works fine for me. But the ease of use is so good. It's so light. It's definitely the comfiest helmet I've ever owned and used, and I've used a lot of them. It's incredibly.
Have you
light.
used the Quest 2?
Yeah, I've used the Quest 2. Yeah, it's good. It's not, but this is better. The Quest 2,
because
not wireless, because that's just free. So yeah, take that out. But then the quality is just on the floor at that point. You're on mobile.
Yeah, because I have a Quest 2, and I thought, honestly, I was blown away because I hadn't used any VR device since PlayStation VR 1 and everything else around there, like the early Valve stuff, like all of that I had used. I put on the Quest 2 and I was blown away by how far we had come in 5 years. I think a lot of people tried out VR. I mean, we're coming on to about a decade ago or maybe 6 years ago. And they said, it's cool, but it's crazy expensive. And it fogs up, or with some of them, it weighs way too much, or I have to plug in 5 cables. The Quest 2 really impressed me, not because it felt perfect, but because it felt so much better than what we had before in comfort. It was just ridiculous. So I'm really curious if you think, and it wouldn't surprise me if it was, but if you think this is significantly more comfortable than that.
I do, yes. It's significantly, probably not, but certainly you can feel the difference. So I think that the big areas than PSVR that's easier is it's not only the weight, it's where the weight's distributed. It just doesn't feel like you're wearing a helmet most of the time. You don't think about it. Whereas certainly the Rift S, I think, is quite cumbersome when you wear it. The design at the front, the weight at the front, how it all works. You can feel like you're wearing something. It's not heavy by any stretch of imagination, but you can feel it. Whereas on this, you can't. Also, it doesn't fog up anywhere near as much as I did under the helmets. Some of that is the fact that the design's really good and the little fan on it. So I like all of that. But one of the big benefits I found on it is you've got pass-through on the Rift S. You've got, it's not new. It's not a new functionality, but it's the integration here. You've got a physical button on the helmet, which you don't have on the Rift S, where you can just press it, and at any point you can see straight through. It's really good. It's really clean, and it's now.
And it's like easy to find, and press.
Yeah, and if you go too close, it will do the same thing as Rift. It will give the warning barriers, and it will tell you where your controllers are, and you can flip back and forth, and it never becomes a problem. But the room scanning is incredible. The software in here is great. It scans your room, it works everything out. It's hassle free, and you're done. But the biggest
and you've done that with the Quest 2, right? I have to ask because that is a thing that impressed me, like how easy it was to do the spray paint thing on the ground and you're just done, that impressed me.
Yeah, so you can do that in this, but in the PSVR, it actually scans the room for you. So all it does is it builds that for you and says, "Are you happy with it? Do you want to change it?" And then you do the same things you do on the Rift, where you just wand it and push it out, or bring it in. So all of that is simple. But one of the big problems I always found with my Rift, and I still do now, is it builds the room and it always tries to put you in the middle of the bloody room. So do you know if you've got a chair and then one day you think, I'm going to play over here? The whole point of having a VR helmet is you don't need the TV on. So one of the big benefits I found with the PSVR, like I had with the PSVR 1, is you can hold the button down and recenter your view. So it doesn't matter where you are in the room, it'll always put you in the middle. So you're important, not the layout of the room's important. But you can jump in and out of games far, far easier than you can on a PC. Some of that is platform, you got to jump in. But with the Rift, you've got to load up the bloody Meta app, and then you've got to go into Steam VR and all that hassle on top. Whereas here, you are literally in and out of games using the same menu system, using the DualSense controllers, which just feel like two split DualSenses, so the Sense controllers. All of that makes it very easy. So it really is reducing the barriers of getting into VR. And that's one of the things where I think it's got a big opportunity. The other part is the fact that you can now play full-on games in VR. So, Resident Evil 7, GT7, many of the titles that are coming that have got full VR modes. So you just put it on and play that instead of playing the 2D version. And that makes a huge difference in a lot of titles. I mean, if Resident Evil 4 is going to have it, that is going to be huge. So that's where I think Sony need to work on pushing. That's where I think VR is going to go. And I said this before, it's nothing new. I think that PSVR2 is going to be subsidized by Sony on a lot of developers at this point, because everyone knows that there's no huge market or margins in VR because it's a niche of a niche. But if Sony
for the game sales, right? Because your market's so small,
So you can get smaller titles that can do well because they don't cost a fortune to make, but big, massive titles like Call of the Mountain would have been expensive. That ain't going to make its money back. That's why it's expensive. But it is a great experience. It's a big theme park, ride that you would go and love, and it's great. But it isn't a long, you're not going to keep going back to it, playing it over and over again. GT7 is that title. People will live in GT7 because of how good it is and how transformative it is when you can do all this, have all this visual quality in a VR helmet. And racing's kind of made for VR. It's perfect for it. So that's where I think Sony will push. They'll push to have full VR modes in big games. And once that becomes a big enough market for them, which I think they could have, and I do think VR's got legs. I think a lot of people have this vision that it's never going to catch on. I disagree. I think it will catch on. I don't think it'll ever be as seamless as 2D for now. It won't be until you get to glasses. When you can put glasses on your head like you can, then it will be there. But until that day, it won't be as easy as a normal TV screen. But I think that Sony are in the best position to push VR forward because they've got the investment capital to do it, and they've also got two options here with the PSVR. So probably jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm almost sure, I said it before, I think the PSVR 2 will be PC compatible at some point. It makes sense because Sony are already releasing games on PC. They've already got a marketplace for that. They're not doing day and date. I don't think they ever will. They'll push it out for a few years, but I think the PSVR 2 will become compatible and then compete with other headsets in the PC space. And I think that's when everyone will change their tune and go, actually, for £500, it's a bloody great headset. I'm going to buy one, because they could make this integrate directly into Steam. Let's say, for example, Valve work out a deal that might include Half-Life Alyx to go one way and the other.
So I'm glad you brought that up because we had a couple reader mails, like from Reginald Irie and a few others, about like, is PSVR2 likely to come to PC? Because PSVR1 never did. I guess why do you think PSVR1 never did? Do you think it was just too clunky to like support a standard and they knew something else was coming anyways, and that's when you push it? Because I think that's why people would be skeptical, because they never did make PSVR1 compatible with PC.
It would have been too much work. It was never part of the design. I mean, it was never designed specifically for the PS4. And you, like you say, you needed so much stuff. It would never have caught on. It would have been a wasted time for them. They would never have competed against what was out at the time, let alone what was out a year later. So that was never an option for them. Whereas here, everything's done. They just need to hook in to Steam VR. Rather than create their own platform. Not saying they won't, and there's already, there's PlayStation stuff on the PC market. So I think PSVR was never going to be an option. They wanted to see how it did, and we can be sure that it did all right, because here they are again doing another one. So it can't have done that bad. It definitely died off a little bit, but actually there's always been a very consistent. I'm one of them. I've always had a PSVR. I've still got mine. I've played a lot of games all the way through. I mean, I was recently playing Sniper Elite in it, which is a great title in VR. No one talks about it, but there's so many great titles in VR. And I think that's what Sony have done. They've, like I said earlier, actually, they stick to their guns. They don't go, well, I only made 10%, what's the point? They've gone, well, 10%, we can make that 20, 30% next year. And I think that's what they'll do. So I think PSVR 2 will be big for the next year, maybe 18 months in PS5, and then they'll look at pushing that headset out and recouping some cost onto the PC market. And maybe when they do a slightly updated iteration, Gen 2, like they did with PSVR 1, that's when it hit the market space. But it's certainly easy. I mean, you can plug it into a PC now and it'll pick it up. You can't use it as a VR headset, but it does pick it up as a screen, because I've done it.
What do you mean pick it up as a screen? You can use it as a monitor?
Yeah, you can literally put it in and use it as a dual screen on your PC using the USB-C port, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's funny.
Yeah.
That just shows you how much easy this will be to program for. Like, why bother putting millions of software supported to the first one when they know this thing's just going to plug in and work, Well, they haven't encrypted they haven't encrypted video on it, or at least what they need, but I think it's 1080p. I'll have to check, but I think it comes up as a 1080p screen. It's obviously not. It's a 4K screen, or it's two dual screens, but it works fine. So you can't use it as a VR headset and all that, but it's not plugged in and not recognized. It just brings it up as a screen. Jessie here loves bones, but it wouldn't be healthy for her to constantly eat them as much as she would love that. The same is usually true for reasonably priced instant meals. It can feel like you're stuck whenever you're looking for something that's quick to cook, tasty, healthy, and cheap all at the same time. Well, unless you just choose Vite Ramen. This piece of content is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a delicious American-crafted source of protein and nutrients that takes minutes to make without sacrificing taste. This includes their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice while it cooks, and also their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy, microwavable option for those who truly only have 15 minutes free for lunch, whether you're working from the office or you're working at home. With Vite Ramen, you'll never be too busy to eat healthy either way. So click the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% off on a variety of different products, including special bundles for Moore's Law is Dead fans, raw nudes if you want to make up your own recipes, Vite Go packages and other food products and cooking utensils, and more. Whatever you'd prefer, using the offer code BROKENSILICON and even just clicking the link in the description really helps Moore's Law is Dead tremendously, and it helps you save money on a tasty, quick-to-make lunch meal. Try Vite Ramen today. Well, then I want to talk about the cost then, because this is something that I leaked late last year. I had some pretty deep sources at Meta, and this was like right after they had actually raised the cost on the Quest 2. And I think a lot, of course, their explanation for raising the price is inflation. It costs too much. We can't afford to make it this price anymore. And there's definitely some truth to that. Like, they were selling the thing basically at cost. But the thing is, I had a BOM sheet, which is bill of materials, the cost to build it. And this is when a lot of people in the comments will go, but what about R&D? And this, guys, they take all of that into account when they price out stuff for profit. They take into account the development costs and shipping and all of that. And I found that even when they were raising the price, it cost around $290. I believe the exact estimate they had was $286 to make a Quest 2, and they were raising the price to $300. And I talked to him like, why do you think this is? A big thing was they had taken market share. Meta's running out of money, so they have to start making money on each unit sold. But another thing they said was, moving forward, they just know half the people buying a Quest 2 are buying their games on Steam. They don't get a dime of that. And because of that, they think they need to raise the price moving forward and keep decent margins on these units so that they're sure they're not losing money on a device people are probably using for Steam games. So I guess I'm curious what you think about then PSVR 2's price, because I actually have the bill of materials for what they were projecting the Quest 3 cost, that has DDR5, a screen that's probably pretty comparable in quality to the PlayStation VR2 screen. I think this is planned to come out at the end of this year, the Quest 3, but it also has wireless RAM, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi cards, all of these things add another $50 to $100 to the cost. And it came to costing probably around $400 to $500, like $350 to like $450 or something to make. What that would suggest to me, and what the engineers I talked to also thought, is PSVR 2, because it doesn't need the wireless, the RAM, all of the storage, all this other stuff, even with the nice attachments it has, it probably costs $300 to $400. And so if Sony wanted to, they could have sold this for $450. Now, I don't think they made big profits on PSVR 1. I see this as a pretty big shift in strategy here. I don't think they're making like a 100% markup, but I would suggest Sony's making pretty good profit per unit sold. Do you think that's because they look around and they see that everyone else is charging more than them? Or do you think it's probably a bit of everything, but do you think it's more so like they know this is eventually going to come to PC and people are going to buy it and use it for Steam games, and they're maybe setting a cushion in case they want to lower the price in the future, but people get mad if you raise prices, not if you lower them. I guess what do you think to all those things I just threw out there?
Well, I mean, again, I don't know, and I can't know what their BOM costs are, and fundamentally no one else does. They're hypothesizing what the costs are. They definitely have a very good build model in Sony that keeps cost where it needs to be. That said, the headset would not have been cheap to make. Certainly, the Sense controllers do a very good job. They're bigger than the Vive, the Rift touch controllers, and it has a lot of functionality in there. The headset's got vibration motors in it. It's got multiple cameras. Yeah, not as many as other helmets, but certainly enough to do the job. So, all of that said, I don't think they're losing money on it. No, I don't think they're making a fortune, but it's not a loss leader. The VR market doesn't really support loss leaders, and that was Meta's fault, because they assumed that everyone would jump on Facebook and just live in the metaverse, in their head, and that hasn't transpired, as we know, and that was pretty obvious. That was never going to happen in the PC market, because people who play VR are probably not just your average consumer, so they're going to be savvy enough to go, do you know what, I'll use Steam because that's where everything is. So they've put their price up to reflect the fact they need some revenue back, probably a little bit too late. That said, 120 hertz is not standard by any way, shape, or form in the PC VR space, and I don't even think there's Quest 3 is 120 hertz, or at least it's not confirmed.
It is. 2 and 3 is. It wasn't at launch though, but they updated it to support it later.
So it's 120 hertz now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So, but again, every game, does that support that? And probably not.
By now, I would say it does. Yeah. Again, it was an experimental feature, but by now it does. Yeah.
So the point of this is Sony are shipping a product that they can make a profit on. I'm pretty sure that's the case. What that profit is, don't know, but they're not losing money, in my opinion, on the PSVR 2, and that's perfectly fine. But I think they've priced it based on the quality of the headset, the quality of the experience, certainly the software level they're delivering, and also the push they're going to put into the market to make this competitive. Meta know that, because Meta are not naive enough to know that this is a competitor in their market space. Not now, but slightly to left of field, people will go, do you know what? I'm not going to buy a PC at all now, or I'm not going to buy a Meta Quest 2. I'll just buy a PS5 and a PSVR 2 and use that instead, and I get better quality, higher visual quality at least. I don't get the wireless and all that functionality that comes with the Meta Quest. Absolutely. And if you're only in it for that light level, then you're never going to beat that, because wireless is the holy grail for VR. Everyone knows that, because it just gets rid of the tethering. But you're not going to get the same experience you got in PSVR. And I think Sony have just literally priced it at that market to inevitably drop it when a refurb comes along with it slightly cheaper in terms of a new generation, and or reduce it once the Quest 3 comes out and they drop theirs onto the PC market at that time. I think that's the target.
Yeah, like maybe playing it a little safe now in an uncertain market, and you think, well, but when Quest 3 comes out, if we need to, we can drop the price and launch it on PC right next to their launch, and we're set up to do that. That's what you think they're planning then, basically.
I do. I think they're hedging their bets on the market. If you look at it, they're in the UK, they're £530. Well, it's the same £30 that went up on the PS5. So realistically, their target was $499, in my opinion. That was always their target for the PSVR2, and that was still actually, reality cheaper than a PSVR1, because with that, you didn't even get the Move controllers, you didn't get a camera. Mm-hmm. So they are shipping more in the box, which does the job better than anything else they've shipped, and certainly up with the very best helmets on the market in the PC space for less money, realistically. So they're in a good position, because they're saying, try and find a helmet that does what ours does for £500. We'll wait. Mm-hmm. And they're not wrong to say that. And I think that's where they are. The problem is they're not in the PC space at the moment, so they have got a captive audience, as I always say. If you want it, you've got to buy a PS5.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, though, I can't help but feel that this tells me, though, they're not sure the market is ready to go out and buy 20 million devices, because what I was hoping, and a lot of people I've talked to as well were kind of hoping here, is that they would aim for like 300 to 400. And then they do that because they think, like the previous one, they had the biggest VR market share for a little bit there, PSVR1, for Meta launched their, loss leader device itself. Like, I guess I was kind of hoping Sony would think the market's ready to just go for it. Here's a $400 console. Here's a $350 VR device. Get into this, and you know what? No one can compete with us. We're ready to take the whole market. To me, this tells me they're still not sure if the market's going to have support like 20 million people or not, because it's a risk. Like when you price something a little above cost, you're calculating that it's cheap enough, if you do that, to take the whole market, captive them, and sell them stuff. To me, this tells me Sony thinks it still needs to be a little conservative, because maybe the market isn't ready to go mainstream.
Absolutely. But I think you've answered your own question, which I was going to say, which is literally Facebook have proven why Sony haven't done that. Meta took the market by putting out a loss leader. Look at their financial position now. They overreacted to the market to stop PSVR1 running away with it. And it wasn't the best technology on the market. So they literally did what Nintendo do. Well, actually, the best technology doesn't win. Hey-ho, MetaQuest. So that's the first reason. Sony are hedging their bets. But also, that you've got to remember that the shipping of PSVR2 isn't just the hardware they're shipping now. It's the software subsidy they're going to put into the business for the next 2 years. They're in this for the long haul. So their marketing and targets, their sales targets won't be, I've said this before, what they said, 2 million or 3, whatever. And then somebody said,
I think so, yeah, somewhere around there.
So that's realistic. And I think that's a good expectation, because that's also playing the market by saying you don't want to put out silly quotes and then get your stocks to drop because shareholders then go, hang on, you didn't hit your 2 million. You want to put out 2 million. It's the old adage, isn't it? Under promise, over deliver. I think they're going for potentially 2.5, maybe 3 million at the end of the year. I think that's what they're targeting. And they're going to ship on that level. And they've got games lined up to do it, but they're going to have to pay for those games. Resident Evil 7 hasn't come for free. They've paid for that. Capcom haven't done it. There's nothing in it for Capcom to do it. They've paid for it. GT7 would have cost Polyphony quite a few quid to put that together. That's out there. Call of the Mountain, that's completely subsidized. There's a lot of R&D into the box, which won't be Sony won't factor that into the headset. They'll sell the headset at its bomb cost to make the margins on it they need, so it's not a loss leader. But they've also got to put some revenue in there on the games and everything else, so that when they go to all these teams and say, we're going to pay for this port, we're going to pay for you to update this version on our title. And there's a lot of titles that are coming out with upgrades over the current PC versions in VR that are going to hit PSVR. All of that costs. So they're factoring all that in. So they're in it for the long game. And that long game, in my opinion, is 3 years. They've got a 3-year game. And that's how long this is going to run for. And I think if things turn out well, they'll probably delay the PC release if they don't need it. And if it doesn't go as well, or ironically, if it goes even better, or MetaQuest starts grabbing a hold, maybe they release it earlier. So I think Sony are in a good position, because I think they're in a position of power at this point. They've literally said, here's our hand. It's really good. And it's actually a very good price in the PC space, but we can make money on it now and grow the market in the PS5 space. And then when we start shipping games over, we can port all these games over to PC and potentially earn a revenue stream off Steam and or get people to buy a helmet. So this is less risky, in my opinion, for Sony than PSVR 1 was, because of the situation they're in. They didn't have a PC market at that place. They do now. And yeah, admittedly, their games don't always sell really well, but it's still an extra revenue stream, and they're competing against people like, Meta and Valve. So I think it'd be interesting for them and seeing what they do. They've thought about this long and hard, and they've certainly, to bring it back to the point, they are not guaranteeing that VR will win, in my opinion, but they're certainly not losing money on trying. That's what I think they're doing.
Well, yeah, I guess it just depends who you ask to at Meta that I talk to. Like, there is a large faction within Meta that's fed up with lost leaders and feels, honestly, from what I've heard from some of the engineers, like, feels compelled to maybe overcorrect. And, we'll see what happens. If the Quest 3 comes out, and I've told it could, and costs $600, then you'll go, well, maybe if they would have charged $400 the whole time, they wouldn't have had to overcharge for their follow-up device. Although I will say the wireless thing does make me hesitant, because I have the Quest 2 like desktop app that everyone ends up buying when they get a Quest 2. And as much as you basically just have to pay an extra $20 for this thing that makes it work perfectly with PC, it does work perfectly. Like, I'm upstairs right now. My desktop is next to me here. And when I want to use my Quest 2, I boot it up downstairs and it wirelessly connects. Latency is not an issue. And I just walk around my whole house, with it. And that ease of use, I'm sure at the resolution it does and stuff, it's easier to do without compressing it than doing full HDR. I think it's above 1440p per eye on the PSVR2. But at the same time, it's like, do you think they could update this in the future, though? Because here's the funny thing. You can get extra battery packs that kind of balance the headset better, even for pretty cheap for the Quest 2. And they're cheap because, look, the thing charges with USB-C, meaning you just mount some people didn't even buy a special thing. They just took their cell phone charging battery bank and hook it into the Quest 2. It charges by USB. You just add 2 hours of battery life and you just put the thing in your pocket or something. Like, do you think because it's only powered by USB, Sony would ever consider launching an add-on that has a battery in it, Wi-Fi in it to send the signal, and then it's just like an extra $100 or something, and now it is wireless? Like, do you think that's something they would do, or do you think they just stick to like adding nothing to it? Because it is only powered by USB. I see no reason why they couldn't make that work if they tried.
Well, the problem they've got is the receivers in the PS5, the Wi-Fi 6 receivers, wouldn't be able to push the video feeds they need. They haven't got enough dual nodes on there. I think 4x4 or might even be more, 6, but I can't remember what they are. I'll have to check. But I think that's their big blocker. That's not to say they couldn't release a device on PC that had that in it if the helmet could take it. So there's definitely options with power and wireless and all that, certainly in the PC space. For PS5, I don't know. A Gen 2 version absolutely could happen if there's a new PS5 Slim, or there came out another little USB dongle you plug in the back, which does have the relevant nodes for Wi-Fi 6, then yeah, it's all possible. Again, I think all those things, though, are unlikely, because what Sony won't do is they won't divvy up the market by splitting up different functionality like that. That would be a very dangerous game in the PC space for them. I don't think they do it. But for PC, I think anything's possible. It's certainly far, far easier. And like you say, people will probably mod the PSVR 2 to run with a battery pack very quickly and the USB port. All of that's possible, but you can even probably get a wireless USB-C feed from the headset to something else on the PC. There's definitely options there.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, there's definitely options there. I don't see Sony doing that. I see Sony sticking to a wired solution because they're going to compete with that same premium headset that's on the market now, and even the Quest 2. If you want to go premium quality, you got to plug it in. You can't do it wirelessly. So that's that's still their market. I think they're focusing on. They've always been leading edge technology. I don't see them changing that, but that's not to say they wouldn't in the future. So it'd be interesting to see what they do though. Or when they announce a PC option. Nothing I've said is fact that they might never go into PC. I just assume they will at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like, why not to me when they do, because it is funny, right? I talk about how I wish it would have been more aggressive. All of that has in pricing, all of that has to be couched through the lens of, well, you have to get a PS5 to use this thing. So to make it aggressive, that's why, so that people will justify getting both. But the second you put it on PC, it's like, well, the only competition it has is the Quest 2, which is lower resolution at this point. Then, I mean, everything else is lower resolution and costs twice as much or something, unless you're getting one of those Pimaxes, and those are certainly not cheap usually as well. Well, all right. So I want to move on to something here while I have you. We actually skipped ahead to make sure we got to the PSVR discussion, but something that we didn't get to yet is talking about like Xbox refresh and PlayStation 5 Pro and all of that different stuff. And I think we talked about it pretty heavily last time you were on. And I re-looked at the information that I leaked back then. And it's funny because about, I think it was actually over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, I leaked that, and I got this directly from some people at AMD, that whether or not they come out, for sure there are design teams working on rough designs for a PS5 Pro, an Xbox Pro console, whatever, and that even more so, I think the biggest part of that leak actually, which people for some reason ignored mostly actually, was that there's a 6nm Xbox Series S, right? Because like a lot of the leak that people get hyped about is a PS5 Pro, but I'm like, yeah, but the stuff I actually had details about, like concrete details, was an Xbox Series S 6nm refresh. Maybe a stronger one too. Maybe they enable the full die. Maybe they clock it faster because the Series S is clocked very low for really what it needs to be. And on 6nm, you could conceivably clock it quite a bit faster. And you just give it faster memory. Maybe give it 16 gigabytes of RAM to have parity with the Series X. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that this thing was hoping to come out end of 2022, early 2023, and that there was also a 6nm PS5 Slim coming at some point. Well, here we are. I have pictures of it. PS5's using 6nm now. So that actually is out before the Xbox Series S 6nm refresh. And I'm just kind of jumping into this, like, why do you think that is? Like, there were so many, at least I had, and obviously, you can take it or leave it, but I at least had a lot of evidence that the Series X or Series S 6nm refresh was coming first, then probably some PS5 6nm Slim thing, which it seems like the Slim SoC is out, but the Slim chassis isn't ready, it kind of seems like. And then there might be Pro consoles. Like, why do you think we haven't seen a 6nm Xbox Series S yet? And then I want to get into what you think about Pro consoles as well.
Well, in terms of 6nm, they'll all go to it because in the end, when you change your fabrication node, it's cheaper to go with what's basically in the pipe at that point, so you get more out of the wafer. So, it might cost you more for the wafer, but you tend to get less waste, better yield. So that's the first reason why they do it. Most of the time, that's why they do it. The reason why,
and the 6nm PS5 is like 18% smaller than the launch one. So
yeah. So they're going to. I know you know this. I'm kind of answering for the audience and stuff, not trying to patronize. But
no, I know.
Yeah. So that's the first reason. The reason I think Xbox haven't done it is because of just stock. Why ship a new 6nm? I'm not saying there isn't one out there. Maybe they've got some out somewhere to get some cost back, but they've probably got quite a lot of backlog. I mean, figures show that I think the Series S are sold more than the Series X generally. I think it's a better. It kind of hit their market in terms of people just buying into that Game Pass model. So I think, or at least it was 50-50 at worst. So I think there's probably better margins on the Series S, in my opinion. They're probably getting more out of the same die, so therefore they can squeeze more out of those units, and they're picking that and shipping that instead rather than Series X where they've got a lot of backlog stock. So I think it makes more sense for them to try and push something that's selling better. And they've got a lot of subscription models, which, although I'm not a big fan of, they do. I think they do sell quite a few using that. Get the console, pay £20 a month for 2 years or whatever, and then you own it at the end, whatever. I think a lot of Series S go that way. So I think that's probably what they've done. And they're probably just not shipped to 6 nanometer because, we've got a warehouse full of Xboxes, so why make more? That said, I wouldn't be surprised if there's one out in the wild somewhere. There's ones already out that just haven't got into mass circulation yet because wholesalers are not going to buy them if they've got a backlog of stock. So it's kind of, chicken and egg. Well, what's the point of me buying more Series X's when I've got a load over there? It's better for Xbox because they're going to get a better margin on it, but it's probably not better for the reseller unless they're going to get a better margin on the purchase. So I don't know where it sits. So that's what I think about why they've done it and how they, and why one hasn't.
Well, and there was no big announcement, right, for the PS5 6 nanometer die. They didn't even change what the outside of the case looks like. They just made it lighter, started using the 6 nanometer die, and it turns out people had already bought them and everyone just discovered it, right? And they're like, oh, wait, it's already 6 nanometer. Sony didn't say anything. So I guess you're right. There's a chance they're already somewhere in a warehouse, 6 nanometer Xbox Series S's. But if you have pyramids of these things on Best Buy floors, then they need to sell those before the 6 nanometer ones show up. And so far, the PS5 keeps selling better. So maybe they just got into circulation sooner.
Well, yeah, I mean, PS5 has been in low supply, high demand for years since it's come out. And I think this year is the first year where that's kind of resolved. Lo and behold, they've gone 6 nanometer. That's helped them, hasn't it? Because everyone knows, as you've reported multiple times, the die requirements and certainly the demand is sky high. So people just can't get what they need. So Sony have been affected like everybody else. So they've had to wait until they can get more out of the same die when they get their allocation. 6 nanometer makes sense. That said, though, what you said before, this is not new. I mean, every console I've ever known, every piece of hardware will get reductions. Yeah. It will get, and no one ever mentions it. PS3 had multiple die shrinks. In fact, I think it was the most die shrunk console they made, and no one mentioned it. They'll never change the box. I mean, Jesus, the PS3 launched and had different versions in 3 months across different countries. They got rid of the Emotion Engine hardware in it, the software that was on the chip to try and emulate the PS2. They cut other areas, then full software emulation, and none of that was announced. They just said, 60 gig, 40 gig, 20 gig, 10 gig, whatever. So all of that is quite standard. And this is always the case. You ship it, especially when it's a loss leader, you ship it at first and then you recoup your costs by, guessing the market and making more money later on when the BOM costs reduce significantly, so you can make the same profit or more profit on the same price. So that's what they're doing with the PS5, and they've just been cleverer in reducing that down. So a lot of it is they can reduce the chip size, therefore they get more out of it. They therefore cut the cooling costs, that gets lowered, and copper's expensive. Metal's expensive generally at the moment. It's mad. So a lot of these things are just general standard business practices to keep you in the black and keep things down. That said, yeah, everyone's heard about the diskless PS5. That makes sense. I think that's the next thing. I don't think there's going to be a PS5 Pro. I've always said this. I've never thought there will be. There will be a slim, so to speak, and I think that will be what everyone thinks is the PS5 Pro, and that'll probably come with a newer, or at least some point get an even smaller node shrink. But I think that Sony are just going to stick with PS5. There's going to be no cross-generation stuff, and I think that's what they'll do going forward. I think Xbox could do anything. That said, launching a new SKU onto market, marketing, naming, branding, everything, it costs a huge amount of money. I don't think Xbox would get the budget to launch a new piece of hardware now. So I don't think they would. I think they'll do the same thing, which is whatever we get, we'll cut the cost, we'll ship as many as we can. And I think they're doing it now. If they're not on 6 nanometer now, I'll be amazed. But they're probably not selling that many through to retail. And that's the point.
That's interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about because, like, I think what was going on a couple of years ago, basically, with both of these companies is it was a booming market. They couldn't keep the consoles in stock. There was some inflation already starting. And then so they're like, well, maybe we find a way to sell this for more. That's why you do a pro console. And honestly, guys, a lot of it is it costs them 20% more to make the thing twice as the performance. So they can justify selling it for 600 or 700 or something. And I think they might both have different reasons for looking around now and going, this market doesn't want an expensive console, right? Because Microsoft's financials might dictate that launching some new SKU with new marketing that further, splits apart development into different verticals of performance is not something they can justify financially a lot right now. Sony can justify anything if they'll make money off of it, but they might be deciding, yeah, maybe a PS5 Slim is cool, or PS5 Pro would be cool, but I think this market wants cheaper products this year, not more expensive, right?
Yeah. Launching a premium product in a recession is not good business sense. Just isn't. So, yeah.
Stating the obvious, but stating it nonetheless. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So you've hit the nail on the head. I just can't see either of them from a commercial perspective doing that. It doesn't make sense. But absolutely, they will cut costs as much as they can. In fact, no time now more than ever will they cut costs, because that is the whole point. Cut the supply chain, cut the manufacturing costs, cut the BOM costs wherever you can. And as you said quite rightly earlier on in the podcast, marketing is always, well, not always, but most of the time can be far more expensive than its return, especially when you go mad. And I think Xbox have done that far too often. And I think Sony learned themselves when they've gone a bit mad, and they've called all that in. And it doesn't seem to have affected their sales in any way. So they're kind of proving themselves right at this point.
Well, so Kenahoon25 writes, and it says, "Hey, Tom and NX Gamer, am I the only one that thinks making a pro console this gen makes too much sense to not do it? The PS5 is already 6 nanometer, and I'm sure the Xbox Series X will be soon too. Why not use RDNA 3 and Navi 32, which is supposed to be on 6 nanometer? Well, Navi 33 is not 32, but the point is he goes on to list all of these new features, graphics card architectures, dies coming out. And with all of these things coming out, I think it can look like it's obvious that this would be easy to design and make, but I don't know. I mean, all of those things cost money. The one thing I would say, though, is, do you not think, though, it would be really easy to do a half-assed pro, if I may call it that? Like, look, they don't even need to design a new die. It's already on 6 nanometer. Couldn't they just take that and give it, actually, from what I'm hearing recently, like the RAM speed used for the launch of the PS5, they don't even really make it anymore. They're just downclocking faster GDDR6 because that's just where the market's at. RAM gets faster. They mass produce it. The cheapest sticks are often faster than what the older cheapest sticks used to be. And so, like, doesn't it just make sense to maybe use GDDR6 chips that are 50% faster and just clock it a little faster? And all games come with variable frame rate modes now. If it boosted performance like a flat 20% in all of those modes, might it not make sense to do some kind of PS5 Pro? Not something like last gen where it was like twice the performance, or with the Xbox One X, it was like, I don't even know, like 4 times the performance of the Xbox One. Doesn't it seem silly, though, to not do something like that? Maybe like some basic bare minimum. Hey, here's the new discless PS4. It's $400 and it's slim and it's half the size. Here's the new PS5 Pro. It's $500 or $550. It's only like 20 to 40% better, but it is. All of the games that used to use dynamic resolution, they now more likely to stay at 4K. Like, don't you think that would make sense, though, still?
It would make sense for Xbox. It wouldn't make sense for Sony. That Sony are not going to try to. They tried very hard to not fragment their market with the Pro. Like I said before, in my opinion, to the detriment of the Pro. They hamstrung the RAM, they hamstrung the bandwidth more than the pixel fill rate. So they did what they could to just push 4K. Makes sense. There's no need for that now. PS5, if you think about what the PS5 does, it delivers 4K. It will deliver 8K, but it's just marketing tags. It will do 120 FPS. It will do VRR. Again, they did all those things because they didn't follow the hardware design, and they put VRR in later. They put 1440p in later because they don't follow the standards. They have a man in the middle, and they handled that same as a PS4. So I don't think they would, because there's no benefit to them and only a detriment to them. And you got to look at these things not from you, a gamer perspective, and a hardcore. And I'm not saying you as in you, Tom, but I mean generally the market, as in you've got a console. You're shipping a console to thousands of developers. if you create more variability for them, they've then got more potential work to test. So if you've got a pro and a standard, irrespective of how you deem it, if you tell the audience you've got a pro and a standard, you've then got some additional Q&A and management to do with that piece of hardware, however small it may be. But you think about the boost mode, Sony went over and above to be very careful with the boost mode on the Pro, because what they don't want is to disdain the audience. One of the things that everyone's used to is good quality, fast response, and performance out of their consoles. Not always. The PS3 was terrible, as we know, and they learned from that. It's that whole adage, you can always take away, you can never give back. So you can't, sorry, the way around, you can always take away from a piece of hardware, but you can't give it back to the developer. So if you say, I'm going to take 250 meg away from you, that's it, it's gone forever. You can never give it back. So it's far easier for Sony to say, do you know what? We've got all this additional margin. As you said, GDDR6, we'll use that, we'll downclock it. We've got a faster chip. We can now run the 6 nanometer with all our cores enabled, and at twice, let's say it can run at 3 gigahertz. What's the point? Just soft lock it down to the old version and run it with that extra capacity. And anything we save, we'll save in the manufacturing costs and reduce the cooling and the power, because it's running far more efficient on a lower yield. Because it doesn't.
So you're saying underclock the RAM chips, and now we have a cheaper heatsink.
Yeah, all of that makes far more sense. Now, for Sony, it's a lose-lose. If you ship a product that says this is a Pro, you're going to get a small percentage, but you'll get a percentage of people, specifically people that bought now. So look at it from their point of view. I couldn't buy a PS5, and all of a sudden I buy a PS5 at the beginning of 2023 when they're in stock, and 6 months later you release a Pro version for the same price. You pigs, I hate you, I'm leaving Sony. All of that can create a lot of whirlwind on the online market space. So that wouldn't help Sony's brand, it would just hinder it. So there's no real win for them to do that. But then on top of that, if they really go all out and make it, meaningfully different, so let's say it's 10% different, maybe even 15%, no one's really going to notice that. I will in a review, and people will blow up those issues. But that isn't going to become a known factor. Whereas for Xbox, it could, because that would make more sense. So there is potential that Xbox could, have a better chip and go, do you know what, we're going to announce it. We're not going to change anything. We're just going to announce the fact that from now on, we're going to call it the Xbox Pro or whatever. And this one will target 120 FPS more accurately, will target 4K more accurately, and they'll do it. So your point is absolutely bang on. It absolutely could be done. That's how the Pro and everything else came about. As you say, it's a viable solution. I just don't think it's one that Sony will take. And I would have said Xbox would have done it 2 years ago. But where they are now, I don't think they will, because all of that does take money. But I think if anyone would do it, Xbox would. That's what I do think. But I wouldn't hold my breath for a Pro over these consoles. I think that's not going to happen.
Well, it's certainly not happening sooner rather than later. I mean, any Pro consoles that are coming out, especially from Sony, I don't, that's like over a year away then. And any design that they commission, that they put any thought into with people at AMD, the second they say go, there's like a year to 2 years between when you say go and when it's produced, out. So I would say at a minimum, if they're coming out, this is a recession year, and I think they're very unlikely to say go this year. And so if it did, it'd be like a late 2024 thing at most. The one interesting thing, though, is that I do hear, there's like no PlayStation 5 Pro on the horizon for this year, to the people I talk to, at least. Let's put it that way. At least for this year, maybe next year. That the Xbox One kind of sounds like a maybe, and that one sounds even easier to get a boost because they have that segmented memory. They could just give it 20 gigabytes of RAM, give it a unified memory pool, and clock it faster with RAM. That's also, they could, if they did that, they could effectively, if they used faster RAM, 20 gigabytes of it, and unsegmented it, that's almost doubling bandwidth right there. So I do think there is an argument for Xbox, even more so than PlayStation as well. Like, hey guys, there's like 3 things we could do right now to make this thing easily have better performance without having to put all this money into some fancy new RDNA 4 thing, right? And that's why I wonder if Xbox would still do that. But it's also a matter of, but if they do that, how long is that going to take to come to market if they have all of this stock unsold yet? So again, it's just interesting to see different factors for why these companies might not do it. You know what I mean?
I do, and I think that the developer side is the one you can't forget. So another SKU, especially if they go that far, will just create more demands on the developer. They've already got a Series S and an Xbox One. And even though it's very similar and it's in the same XDK and all that other good stuff, there is definitely a cost that people forget about, just the Q&A factor. You've got somebody to test two versions. You've got to optimize, as you said, you've got to optimize for the memory. You've got to optimize for the CPU, the GPU itself. There's a lot of differences. There's enough difference in those two consoles for it to not be a insignificant amount of work. Certainly not, rewriting the whole game, but there's a lot of work there. If they ship another console, that's 3. So there's that part. In my view, what I could see them doing is I could see them saying, do you know what, we've got all this cost, everything reduced. Let's reduce the price of the Series X spec, stop selling the Series S, and just merge it into one that's actually, somewhere in between, and actually lower our price and give ourselves some revenue, but also really take the price cut. So years and years ago, consoles used to get price cuts. So like the Saturn and the PS1 were a good example of it. And the Atari Jaguar, they couldn't give them away. So all of those kind of things happen. Microsoft could do that, and they that would work. Price cuts always work, especially in a recession. All of a sudden, if you've got a console that is £299 but actually performs the same as the Series X and close to a PS5, that might shift the needle. So I can see Xbox doing that more than releasing a Pro version, because they've almost shot themselves in the foot with their own mouth. They bragged about the hardware specs and the teraflops and everything else that started this generation. And you and I were talking about the fact it's not relevant. And I've said it on my channel before they even launched, and that's come true. There's games out now. There's always going to be, peaks and troughs. And I said that will all happen. Certain engines will dictate. So I think Microsoft now know they can't do that again. It will almost be quite quickly shot down, even by their own supported fan base, because they'll go, well, hang on a minute, your Series X isn't doing it, so why is this going to do it? So I think
I feel like every time I have you on, just to like prepare myself for the people to attack me for saying that, I go and look at Digital Foundry and you, and I'm like, what's the last comparisons? Hogwarts, The Witcher 3, this. And I did that. Xbox is not outperforming the PS5 guys. It is not. Harry Potter, Sony wins. In The Witcher, I think in the cities, The Witcher 3 update, in the cities, the PS5 wins. Outside, the Xbox wins. They're the same. Like, every game I've recently checked, besides maybe a Plague Tale Requiem, it's, it's like basically if I were to break it down, I went over like 10 games and like, I don't know, I'd say like 5 of them PlayStation wins, or 4 of them PlayStation wins. 3 of them Xbox wins, the rest are ties. Yeah. At best, you would say they perform the same. So this argument that the Series X is stronger, it isn't. It keeps coming out in comparisons that it's not.
Exactly.
But sorry, go on. I just had to say that, though. There will be links in the description if you want to argue with me, guys.
No.
I have to do this every time because the fanboys are insane. But yeah.
Well, people, they don't like when people say what they perceive as bad things about the hardware, but it's irrelevant to me. It's obviously relevant to you, and anyone who's playing it, you just play the game. So it is what it is on the hardware it is, and the PS5 and Series X are not meaningfully different. There are instances where one can outperform the other by a margin, but the biggest difference you see more often than not is the fact that, everyone goes on about loading, but there's definitely issues in some titles in terms of the development, the APIs. Plague Tale Requiem is a good one, which certainly has some specific issues. But certain engines just, they're well multi-threaded in terms of using all of the cores in the GPU. So when they jump out work across all of those threads, they're just getting more out of them because the work is actually quite well threaded across more cores in the GPU. Whereas some titles just like, bandwidth. And it's easier to make a game that runs faster when everything's faster. So it's ironically, it's easier to optimize a faster GPU than it is to optimize a wider GPU, for want of a better description. So as you say, there's no difference in them at all. PS5 Series X are arguably perform exactly the same. In fact, it's probably the smallest generation. Again, it happens every time diminishing returns. It's so small now that you really are. There's edge cases. There's some titles where there's some weird, because Callisto Protocol didn't have DirectX, and I covered it and said it was to do with DirectX. There's no ray tracing in there because they were used to the PS5 API, and everyone gave me some noise on that. And it turns out the developer totally agreed with me on Twitter. He tweeted my thread and said, great to see the review here where he picked up some of the internal development tools. And that's exactly what I said, which is people don't understand APIs can be a pain in the ass. And if you're doing something as complex as ray tracing, if you're going from PS5's API to Xbox DirectX, it's very different. So there's a big sizable shift there that you're not changing your core source code, you're changing how you speak to the API, and that's a lot of work. And then you get all these edge case issues and bugs and all that kind of good stuff that takes all the time to ship. So what's the point in shipping a broken game, which had problems on PC at the same time, which reinforces that because it's the same API. Mm-hmm. They just said, you know what, we'll take it out and we'll ship it when we're ready, and it took a little bit longer. That's the reality of it. So sometimes people talk about performance differences in hardware, and it's actually nothing to do with the hardware, it's software. Software is still a big part of these developments. So it's really, they're as close as they've ever been, and I don't see a big difference in them. But I'll be amazed if anyone gets a pro version out. But if anyone will, it'll be Xbox, I think. But I think it's more likely they'll just take a cost cut and cut the cost of the hardware if they can, with all of the other benefits they've got, as you've articulated.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I've still got you. If you have the time, I do want to ask a few Nintendo Switch questions. CRCV writes in and says, do you think the new Nintendo console will arrive this year, or do you think that despite a slowdown of sales, they will try to delay it to next year? So, and I had a kind of a leak. It was basically, honestly, if I'm being like in mid 2021 or late summer 2021, I think I would summarize a video I did as trying to shift through all of the noise on Lovelace programmer, like people who have worked with NVIDIA Lovelace and people who have worked on stuff related to the next Nintendo console. And one of the conclusions I came to, both through public information, like the fact that they're not producing the SoC the Switch uses anymore. And if you look at the stockpiles they had of like 30 million, I'm like, I would estimate this will run out of stock at the end of 2023, which means they probably need to have a new Switch around 2023, 2024. And I heard that the plan was 2023, 2024 at the latest. Still not out. Some people thought it would be spring. I somewhat doubt that now, though. You never know. But like, when do you think a Switch 2 is coming? And let's start there. I don't know what you think even about that question.
I think March 2024.
So not this spring, next spring.
Yeah, I think their target will be the end of the quarter because it's just the new thing. They don't need Christmas, but they might try for it. But it doesn't really matter anymore. I think consoles have moved beyond needing to be then. So I think buying them the time and going right at the end of the financial year works for them. So I think it'll be announced this year, released next March. That's what I think.
Okay. Now, Nicholas Terroir writes in and says, hello. For the Switch, do you think Nintendo will prioritize battery life or performance so the product can be sold for longer? The Steam Deck is very powerful, but man, the battery life and size does not make it easy to use or transport. Yeah, I mean, like, where do you think they're going to go with this thing?
They'll prioritize battery life. They always have done. They know their market, and the Switch is so popular, which I didn't see it coming. I was wrong. I'll call that out straight away. Before it launched, I said they are literally going to sell you your nostalgia, and how wrong I was that everyone wanted to buy it, because that's what they did. They sold you loads of stuff that you grew up playing. Not me personally, because I was a little bit older than that marketplace, but and being UK based. But I certainly played. Some of that N64, I did play some of the N64 because I was getting back into gaming then after my first kid. But that kind of market was a surprise to me. But they've always done the same thing. Apart from the GameCube, they've always targeted function and delivery and form over performance. So I think this will be another good balance of a machine. I think they'll prioritize battery life. They'll prioritize performance by using, I think we spoke about it before. I definitely spoke about it on another podcast as well, about DLSS will be in there. It's almost a given.
I've heard that it's, key, right?
Yeah.
Key to the, it's a key feature that every game will use to try to get more performance out of less.
Yeah, and I think DLSS is good. Let's be honest. It's a good solution.
I think so. Not when it came out, but it's very good now.
Yes, yeah, it's got a lot. Yeah, when it came out, it was rubbish. Everyone was saying it was great at the time, and I was like, "Am I blind? No, I'm not. It's not great. It's really bad." But now it's really good, and like things improve. So I think that'll be a good solution. They have to do it because everyone's got a 4K TV now. I know there is 1080p screens out, but the market generally is at 4K. So they'll use that to get to 4K, and that'll be a good solution. That means that instantly gives them a lot of performance back. it means that they can also rely on the fact that they can then, even if they need to, utilize that in the handheld mode, because you're not really going to notice it when the screen is not that big, even from a low resolution. So that could also gain more performance back. And the battery life, I think, will be a almost core development pillar for them. I don't think they'll let that go. If anything, I think they'll go for a longer battery life if they can, and they'll promote that as a sales tactic. Get 4 more hours out of the new Switch with twice the performance and all that kind of stuff. So I think that'll be a good area. I do think, and I've said this on my own channel a while ago, that I think that they're going to look at integrating VR. I think that's a perfectly viable option for them. Whether they do a very, very cheap helmet, remember the RoboBlocks they did with the cardboard VR helmet. They could easily ship this with a VR mode where you drop it into a helmet and then walk around with it on your head.
Yeah, and it's already wireless, so that could be a thing that they set up.
There you go.
And, it doesn't need to be the highest quality, but when has it ever been with Nintendo? No. And they could at least, though, get to a point where they don't aim to beat the Quest 2's performance, but they maybe aim to get close to how it looks at like 60 or 90 hertz for a half the price.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that would be an interesting move there. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's be honest, they have such a good opportunity here to penetrate VR into a market that probably would be unheard of at this point. Because, the Switch has done unbelievably well. But if you've got the opportunity to just buy a cheap, let's say it's a £50 plastic headset with a pair of cheap earphones, it's not going to be the best. That's not what they're going for. They never will. But if you can do that and then jump into VR titles, you've got all of these Quest 2 games that will be, one, easily portable because it'll be ARM. So it's the same core architecture for delivery. It'll
very easy to port them from Quest 2.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And it'll be very easy to get them running on DLSS Tegra hardware in terms of performance and power, that the API from NVIDIA, it isn't going to be in question. The SDK from Nintendo will be top of the tree. So they've got a very big market. So I think what they'll do in terms of hardware is they'll go with whatever Nintendo give them. They won't really optimize it or at least tweak it too much, because that's not what they do.
Whatever NVIDIA gives them.
Yeah, exactly. They'll get a good deal on it, and they'll get a great deal on it because of what the NVIDIA have got out of the Switch deal at the moment. And they'll ship a product that does everything. And I think it has the potential to be as big, if not bigger, than the original Switch, because the one key factor that which I think they might break their own rule on here for making it nice and simple. I'm not saying they will, because it's Nintendo and they constantly like to keep selling you their software over and over again. Is they could make it back compatible with the Switch. If they did that, I think that could be.
You mean the VR aspect of it?
No, I'm sorry. The actual new Switch could literally play your old Switch games as well.
Well, don't you think it has to, though?
No.
Doesn't it?
No.
Really?
Anyone else, yes, but not Nintendo. No, I don't think they have to, no. They are.
It should be easy to, though, with how weak the Switch is, right? Or are you not expecting the specs of the new device to be? Because I think it's almost, it'd be pretty hard for the new specs to not be about 10 times better, right?
It's not a hardware problem. It's a software problem, commercial. So whether Nintendo ship open, free, backwards compatibility in it is up to Nintendo. They could do it, absolutely. Will they do it? That's what I'm not so sure of. Because let's be honest, you can play all your online titles now with Switch, but it's all online. They're getting rid of, they're shutting down the Wii U store, so that's all gone. So all of a sudden, you've got these backwards compatibility options that you used to have and you pay for are now gone. That's what Nintendo do because their IP is worth so much. That's why they're such a good company, because in terms of profit, because they keep their IP at high quality, they treat it with love and respect, and they don't let it go out of use. It's constantly a commercial viable product. They always keep it viable. Even if it's really old NES titles, they'll do it. So that's my only thing is looking at this. I always try and look into both avenues in terms of me as a hardware tech geek gamer and then me as a business person that works in that environment. And I've been around long enough to know that what you think will happen isn't always the case. Nintendo, in my opinion, they don't do things just because it's the right thing to do. They do it combinations thereof. They think outside the box. They create some great products, but fundamentally they're a business that makes money, and that's first and foremost. And I think that's what they do. So it could be backwards compatible, but it could also be backwards compatible in an online subscription service where you pay for it per month. That's what I mean.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, so what specs do you think we're looking at here? Because I think I look at what's out, and I think it's going to be obvious. Nintendo's going to use probably some tweaked version of like the NVIDIA Orin chip. Probably. I mean, maybe the one that comes after that, because there always were some people saying it might use a Lovelace-ish integrated GPU. But like what level of performance do you think they're going to target? Because what they did last gen, man, it really is having trouble running even basic games now, I have to say.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. It's over delivered in terms of what the teams have delivered and how well they've got it running certain titles. Yeah, it's some titles should never have been on it. No Man's Sky was a standout for me. I couldn't believe that they've got that on there. Man,
No Man's Sky's on there now.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I'm surprised.
Absolutely mad. Yeah, and it's the whole thing. It's all that they cut back some of the cities and stuff, but generally it's all there. But in terms of hardware, yeah, I don't know. There's the new Tegra chip, the 299, 239, something it is, whatever. I think that's a real option as the hardware they'll go with, because you could reuse a lot of the boards you've got before. The size is not a huge difference. The design and architecture is not a huge difference. You've got all of that functionality in terms of a core APU with a CPU in it, and it's even got more cores in it. I think it's 12 core that they could split that up with the operating system, therefore making it more powerful. So there's definitely that. But I think in terms of overall performance, as in not taking DLSS into account, just delivery of performance, if this is pushing 20% more than a PS4, I'll be amazed. That's the level I'm looking for. But you think about that, PS4 in your hand with 12-hour battery life or whatever is just mad.
So you think they'll aim to like basically beat the Steam Deck, which people, if they look it up, the Steam Decks, I think teraflops are actually lower than the PS4, but it's a better gaming architecture already in it.
Yeah, better CPU. Absolutely, yeah. So overall,
so you think they'll aim to be around, like maybe better than the Steam Deck, maybe, but more portable, and that's it. They're not going to aim for anything better than that.
I don't think they will. I think because they're with NVIDIA, they will instantly get the keys to the chest of DLSS and ray tracing. So there's definitely, but I just can't see Nintendo making a big deal about ray tracing. But what it will do, and this is where the Switch has really been their big ticket item. This is the first time they've secured, other than when they secured it by force in Mafia style in the SNES, is when they literally got every single third-party manufacturer making games for the Switch. So the fact that they'd have all that in their closet would make a huge difference to a lot of developers. So they could port a lot of titles that couldn't run currently on the Steam Deck, because you can't run ray tracing without any updates to it unless you run Windows on the box itself to get DX, or you do some of the function mess around, which is just out of the hands of most normal people. But on the Switch, you could end up seeing things like Doom ray traced on the Switch running at 720p with DLSS. It's mad, but it'd sell. People, as people have shown, they'll buy Doom a million times.
And as long as they can have some light level of ray tracing, you've got that little bit of a wow factor that it's on a handheld, right?
Exactly, yeah. and that will sell, and that will create stir. So I think that fundamentally, in terms of raw performance, yeah, like I say, a bit better than the Steam Deck would be my expectation, with the caveat that they will have all of the keys to the war chest that is NVIDIA, and their exceptionally good software and engineers skill set in terms of what they deliver for their software development and API. So that's what I expect them to deliver, that kind of level. I expect a 2 teraflop machine at best. That's I hate saying teraflops, but that's probably a good summary.
Yeah. Well, it at least gives you a point of reference to which GPU they're using from that generation. So,
yes.
All right. You mentioned it. I have one more question then. Tired Gaming Dad writes in and says, hello, Tom and Michael. What are your thoughts on where the Steam Deck will go in the future? Mainstream, sold in stores? Will they have a second generation? What will it do? And how and if Proton will change the industry, or if the industry will just keep expecting the Valve and its community to take care of the rough edges. I'm seeing more and more high-profile games launch with direct Steam Deck support, and I finally feel that I can enjoy a Linux-only computer with no need for Windows anymore. My computer is Linux-only right now. Thanks.
Good man. Tired Gaming Dad. I think I've definitely spoke to him before. In terms of the Steam Deck, they'll go with whatever they get a good deal on, in my opinion, from AMD. But I don't think they'll do it yet. I think because, again, they've only just started to sell well. So I think they'll potentially hold off another year, maybe a little bit longer. So maybe 2024-ish before they push out another piece of hardware. And I think they'll continue to work on improving their own development environment in terms of their SDK and certainly their Proton layer in Linux. Because I mean, I've used Linux for years. I've always used Linux wherever I can. But the reality is, you can't really play games on Linux. But as you said, that the Steam Deck has changed all that. There's been so much movement in Wine, Proton, and everywhere else in terms of, you know, the Vulkan DK layer and everything else that makes the whole process much easier. You've got games that ship, the developer hasn't made a version for it, but it's running fine because of the work that Valve do internally to deliver it, or as he says, the community himself. So I'll be very interested to see how, I'm trying to phrase this properly. I'm not saying I know stuff, but I've definitely spoken to people about certain things. I'm very interested to see the strategic partners that Valve makes over the next 12 to 18 months and where that goes, because I see Valve as having one eye on the prize. And right now, Steam is gaming on PC. I know it's been for years, but it is gaming on PC. And even after multiple attempts from Microsoft to take that away from them, it's not worked. And I think that this might be the first time that Valve see an opportunity to go the other way. That's all I'm trying to say.
I think there was this unexpected shrewd thing about Steam Deck where you go, well, why would I get a game on Steam when I can get it for cheaper on sale right now from Ubisoft Store or from EA.com? Or well, now it's called EA's launcher. It used to be called Origin. Thanks, EA, for making me switch launchers again. You know, or from what the series of Microsoft stores that have failed and been relaunched over and over on PC. And I think it's, you know, you've seen some of them melt away. You saw EA push all their Battlefields on their own launcher. Now you can buy Battlefield on Steam again. They've just given up, and so is Ubisoft to some extent. And I think then Valve added this thing where it's like, well, you know, if you buy something on Steam, it works on a Steam Deck, right? You know, and these other ones won't, you know, and that's that little, even if you don't own a Steam Deck, you'll go, well, in the future, if I do, though, I can play it on a Steam Deck. So why don't I spend the extra $5 and get it on Steam instead of some other online launcher, right? And so I do think this is an important thing for them to keep going. It's funny, too, because I leaked Little Phoenix. There's a smaller version of AMD's Phoenix APU that I thought might be perfect for the Steam Deck, but now it's emerging. And I've said this too, that it seems like the graphics portion of it is a lot weaker than I initially thought it was. So I don't think that's ready. So I don't think they really have anything from AMD that would be cost effective probably until next year. But you would agree they probably have, they're going to update it, but it's probably more like a 2025 thing, isn't it? The Steam Deck too.
Potentially, yeah. I think 2024, 2025 is its target base. I don't think they'll go to stores, but I think they'll sell outside of their own. So what I mean by that, I think they'll potentially go Amazon, places like that, or maybe even elsewhere. I think that's definitely an option for them. They might even, you know, go down the route of putting the Steam Deck as a partnered manufacturer, you know, getting other people to make Steam Decks that aren't manufactured by them, and they just ship out the IP and let them other people make it. I think that's also an option as a brand. I think that's somewhere they could go, and you end up getting different versions of a Steam Deck. So where they've got 3 versions.
Do you mean
now,
same APU, but you can design the chassis and sell it yourself? Or
yeah, well, that yeah, or they go for one that's actually got different specs of APUs. If people want to choose it, if there's that, because realistically, there's no limitation on this to make multiple versions if they wanted to, because it is a PC in your hand, so to speak. I'm not saying they will do it, but it's a more viable option because they currently sell 3 versions which really only have a difference in SSD. They could expand on that by, like you say, having one APU and then having multiple specs of hardware that you pick and choose from, or having other manufacturers build ones that have a standard, a pro model and an extreme model or whatever, which has got slightly more in it with a better docking station and, you know, other functionality they might do. I think that's where they might go. But as you said, it all hangs on whether or not AMD have got the hardware for them. That's their biggest problem.
Yeah, and I mean, they do have the hardware for it right now, but it's expensive. I don't think they're going to use full Phoenix, which would be like double the performance of the Steam Deck or something, I think. they'd want a cheaper version of that, so it doesn't cost an arm and a leg.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see. But in other words, so what is your eye on the prize then? What for them do you think is their ultimate goal?
I think it's to kill off any competition in that market. They really want it because PC gaming, as we know it, might end up going away, as we've seen over the years. So if you think about when PC gaming started, it went from the desktop era with IBM kicking it all off, and at that point you had, in the UK at least, you had your microcomputers. So PC wasn't big here. Microcomputers were, so like your Commodore 64, your Spectrums, then your Amigas, your STs, whatever, and then PC gaming took over, and then it went to a point into laptops, and then it went to tablets, and then kind of now it's all servers and cloud. So PC gaming and Windows and all that isn't as big as it used to be. It isn't there, but Steam is. Steam still is this huge behemoth of a beast that sells on PCs. But if PCs shrink, Steam shrinks because there's less people buying PCs. So Steam now has a vested interest to create its own platform. So I think that's what Steam Deck is.
Make sure there's a low cost option if NVIDIA won't give us it. In other words, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if I can't sell on something that somebody else is making, I'll make my own. And they tried it already with the Steam. What were they called?
Steam boxes, Steam machines.
And that failed. The Steam Deck is just the second run of the same idea, so it's just better implemented. And I think that's what they've done. They've latched onto an option that works, and I think that's what they'll invest in. That's their ticket item now: is make the Steam Deck bigger, broader, and where Steam lives. Because realistically, that's their cash cow. Steam is where they make money. Selling hardware is largely a thankless task because no one really thanks you for it, and you don't make much money in it. Going back to graphic cards and stuff we mentioned earlier. So all of that is a big problem for them, but sometimes it's a means to an end. And I think that's what Steam's end is. Steam's end is to be Sony in the PC space, in my opinion. Be PlayStation.
And then everyone chipped away at them, but they kind of didn't do it well enough to really take any market share from them in a meaningful way. And having your own platform is almost just like insurance, right? That in the future, someone can't take it away. And they've finally succeeded to a decent degree in doing that, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that 2 million Steam Decks sold now or something. So pretty good.
Well, yeah, as many as they can make. That's the thing is, in terms of who's competing for capacity at TSMC, I think they're pretty low down the list. And so like the selling 2 million is incredible that they've even accomplished that when you consider the size of the company.
Oh, no. And I love it. I love my Steam Deck. I mean, they've just released a beta where you can actually swap games now between your PC and your Steam Deck. That is life-changing for me because now I don't need to download it on my Steam Deck. I can just copy it from my PC. I love that.
All right, well, that's all of the subjects roughly that I wanted to get to. Is there anything else that you wanted to discuss?
No, I'm good. I think it's time for me to hit the sack. It's very late here.
I was going to say it's very late where you are as usual. You gave us a ton of your time right before you went to bed. So thank you so much for that. And a reminder that this is, dropping like when PSVR2 comes out in the UK and that you will have a ton of coverage for that. So go to, the link will be in the description. Please, people, go to NX Gamer's YouTube channel and subscribe to see that ongoing coverage as well. And I mean, thank you to coming to speak with us, before it was out and giving us your expertise. I think there's some really fascinating stuff here and a lot of stuff I didn't expect to talk about.
No, good. I appreciate it. Thanks again, Tom, for having me on. I always like talking to you. It's great. And thank your audience for listening to me waffle on for a bit. Thanks all. Appreciate it.
And I do always appreciate when you guys listen to me and anyone else waffle on this podcast. Remember to subscribe to Broken Silicon on a podcast app. Give us a review. Subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead on YouTube. Ring the bell button. From what I've seen in recent statistics, 75% of the viewers aren't subscribed. Please double check that you're subscribed if you're listening to this and ring the bell button. And then you support us on Patreon. That's how you ask us questions as well. There's so much exclusive content for you as well there. And once again, thanks everybody for listening. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan. audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carbon Cry and Kerry no Sugata as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/support page in the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Kerry no Sugata as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guests questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Greffa, Greg Pataki, Mohammed Wakwari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, Little Jeremy, Jan Rano, Daniel Hyde, Shredbird, Brian Riggleman, Dr. Foreman, Sam Miller, Deke, Josh Law, The Mechanical Philosopher, Terrence Harrod, SNES Chalmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchik, Andrew S., Frank Zielinski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Justice Brennan, Joshua L. Herrera, Valko Malev, The Boss Haas, Nicholas Buckner, Spanthem G. Spanthem, Jonathan, Lord Starstream, General Chips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Aziris, Gregory S. Hacker, Dominique Koch, Jake 223, Jake Martin, Cameron, BenTCZ, HardForum.com, Original Ross, Slicky, Lance Basser, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, GZ Ziggy, Sarcastro, Stefan Hart, David Sebastian, Meat and Pork, Stu, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jaskowyak, Travis Gooding, Holden Mobley, Nanyan, Chris Rich, Deepest Learners, Mad, Zuzu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Chuck Glidden, Sammy Malas, Greg, AWS Danny, Patrick Groh, Abel Chief, Brett Summers, Milton, Stephen Dick, Tommy, John, Buchet, Mark Mitchell, McDaffie, AC, James Anderson, Marshall Pierce, Mark Raidmaker, Dave Schultz, 3DS Boyo 8, Al Buma, Norithio, Matthew Lindovazo, Stefan, Cole Addict, Henry Zhang, Judson N, Keith Moore, The Grid, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Joseph Kelly, Ruth Taurus, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jim Ferreira, RB Racer, Keith Moore, Akita Abdul Kadar, Precision, DNA Tech, Radiant Technologies Group, Jean O'Shea, Royce Meyer, Charles Russell, Reginald Ari, Slushbot, Teak Autumn, Jackson Miller, JSMMH, Neithrusink, Mean Dean, Cal, Andre Jacques, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Sedler, Jordan Simkovic, Loophole 35, Winstar, William Welpley, James I. Raider, Corey Leonard, Nell Lima, John Shin, Justin Bussell, Kelvin, Austin Hagerty, Roger Davies, Shay Julian Leaked, Corey Chappelle, Evan Dingle C2, John Iverson, Michael Aaron, The Eternal Dreamers, Jansen Angima, Him Sagung, Derek Lambian, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.